Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the heavy wooden doors of a medieval convent, where the air smells of beeswax candles and whispered secrets. You might think you know what life was like behind those stone walls, endless prayer, silent corridors, women devoted entirely to God. But tonight, you're about to discover that medieval convents were stages for some of the most shocking scandals, forbidden romances, and secret rebellions in history. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, about why the church became so obsessed with controlling women's religious communities. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or what drew you to this mysterious topic. Your words always brighten my day. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible, turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing outside a convent in 13th century France, listening. The evening bells have just finished ringing for vespers, and you expect silence. Instead, you hear something unexpected, soft laughter, the rustle of fabric, a whispered name. You move closer to the garden wall, and through a gap in the stones, you glimpse a young nun in her black habit, her veil pushed back slightly, reaching her hand through an opening in the wall. On the other side, invisible to you but clearly present, someone grasps her fingers. The hands linger together, and you catch fragments of whispered conversation endearments, promises, the kinds of words that should never pass between a bride of Christ and a man of the world. This is your first glimpse into the hidden world of forbidden courtships in medieval convents, where the rules of enclosure were strict, but the human heart proved endlessly creative. Throughout the Middle Ages, convents were supposed to be sealed environments where women devoted themselves entirely to spiritual life, cutting off all contact with the secular world. The reality: many convents became epicenters of romantic intrigue that would make a modern soap opera look tame. The architectural layout of most convents inadvertently facilitated these secret meetings. Convents needed walls to separate sacred space from secular space. But walls have two sides. They needed gates for deliveries and visitors, but gates can be lingered at. They needed gardens for growing herbs and vegetables, but gardens have shadowy corners. Clever nuns and their admirers exploited every one of these design features. The problem was so widespread that by the 14th century, bishops across Europe were issuing nearly identical warnings about the corrupting influence of convent architecture itself. One of the most common methods of forbidden contact was the convent parlour, a room where nuns could receive visitors under supervision. Officially, conversations were supposed to be brief, spiritual, and conducted through a grille or grated window. In practice, parlours became spaces of prolonged flirtation. In 15th century Venice, church authorities became so concerned about the dissolute conversations happening in convent parlours that they issued regulations requiring that two nuns always be present during any visit, that conversations be conducted in loud voices so others could overhear, and that visits last no longer than an hour. The fact that such detailed rules needed to be written tells you exactly how much those rules were being broken. The Venetian case reveals how nuns and their visitors developed sophisticated workarounds. When two nuns were required to be present, pairs of nuns who were friends would attend each other's visits, essentially providing cover for one another. When conversations had to be loud, couples developed coded language that sounded innocent to eavesdroppers but carried deeper meaning to those involved. A request to pray for my soul might actually mean, "I'll meet you at the usual place," An inquiry about the health of your devotions could be asking whether a secret letter had been received. It was romantic espionage disguised as piety. Some nuns developed elaborate systems of coded messages that would impress modern cryptographers. In 14th century England, a bishop's investigation revealed that nuns at one convent were receiving love letters smuggled in by sympathetic servants who worked both inside the convent and in noble households nearby. The letters were hidden in loaves of bread, tucked into prayer books, sewn into the hems of altar cloths, and even concealed inside hollowed-out candles. One particularly industrious nun had been conducting a correspondence with a local knight for 3 years before being discovered, and only then because the knight's wife found one of the nun's letters and reported it to church authorities. The bishop's report describes finding a wooden box hidden beneath the nun's mattress containing 23 letters, several pressed flowers, a lock of hair, and a silver ring. The variety of smuggling methods discovered during medieval investigations reads like a spy novel. Letters were written in lemon juice that became visible when heated, a technique borrowed from courtly intrigue. Messages were written in Latin or French, but with certain words in a personal code only the recipient could understand. Some nuns who were skilled in needlework embroidered messages into decorative pieces that looked like innocent religious art. One 15th century investigation uncovered an altar cloth that appeared to show only vines and flowers, but when examined closely, the stems of the vines formed letters spelling out a message of love. The most daring courtships involved nuns actually leaving the convent grounds. Despite strict rules of enclosure, many medieval nuns had surprisingly frequent reasons to venture outside visiting sick relatives, attending to convent business in town, managing convent properties, even going on pilgrimages. These excursions provided opportunities for prearranged meetings. A bishop's register from 14th century Yorkshire describes a nun who regularly volunteered for errands to the market specifically so she could meet her lover at a designated spot behind the baker's shop. They met this way for 2 years, exchanging gifts and, according to testimony given during the investigation, engaging in immodest behaviour unbecoming to one who has taken holy vows. The investigation reports from this particular case provide extraordinary detail about how the affair was conducted. The nun would arrive at a market wearing her full habit, giving her the appearance of being on legitimate convent business. She would make her purchases quickly, then slip around to the back alley where her lover waited. They had arranged with a baker's apprentice through a small payment to use a storage room for their meetings. The affair only came to light when the apprentice, feeling guilty, confessed to his priest, who reported it to the bishop. Some convents were located close enough to male monasteries or nearby estates that visual communication was possible. Nuns and their admirers developed systems of signals that operated in plain sight, but whose meaning was invisible to anyone not in on the secret. A candle in a certain window meant a message had been left in a hiding spot. A particular way of arranging flowers in the garden meant a meeting was possible. Laundry hung in a specific pattern indicated that a letter had been received. Historians still argue whether these systems were as widespread as church reform documents suggest, or whether anxious bishops were seeing conspiracy in every coincidence. The social class of many nuns made these courtships particularly complicated and particularly scandalous. Many women in convents were from noble families, and they brought their aristocratic expectations with them. They were accustomed to courtly love poetry, to flirtation, to the social games of their class. When one 15th century prioress was accused of entertaining male visitors too freely, she defended herself by arguing that as a duke's daughter, she couldn't possibly be expected to refuse visits from her social equals. It would be, in her words, discourteous and beneath my dignity. The bishop was not persuaded by this argument, but it reveals the tension between noble identity and religious vocation that permeated many medieval convents. The consequences for nuns caught in romantic relationships varied wildly, depending on their family connections, the severity of the relationship, and the mood of church authorities. Some nuns received mild penances, extra prayers, temporary restrictions on receiving visitors, or being assigned less desirable duties like working in the convent's laundry. Others were publicly humiliated in ways designed to break their spirit. They might be forced to eat sitting on the floor of the refectory while their sisters ate at the table, or made to walk through the convent wearing a sign describing their sin. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of these forbidden courtships is what they reveal about medieval women's agency and resistance to institutional control. These weren't passive victims of male attention, these were women actively choosing to maintain connections to the world beyond the walls, to assert their own desires, to write their own stories even within the constraints of religious life. A document from 15th century Italy records a nun who, when confronted by her abbess about a suspected love affair, responded with remarkable defiance, "I have one foot in heaven and one in the world, and I shall keep it so." She was punished at Tis, of course, spending 6 months in solitary confinement, but her words echo across the centuries as a declaration of personal autonomy. You stand in that medieval garden now, watching the nun at the wall withdraw her hand and turn back toward the chapel, a small smile on her face. The bells begin ringing for Compline, the final service before bed. She adjusts her veil, smoothing it carefully back into place, and walks toward the chapel door, where her sisters are gathering in the twilight. She joins them, kneeling in prayer with her hands folded and her eyes downcast in the picture of devotion, her secret safe for one more night, hidden behind the facade of holy obedience. The morning sun filters through the stained glass windows of the convent chapel, casting coloured shadows across the stone floor where you kneel for morning prayers. Around you, the nuns chant in unison, their voices rising and falling in practiced harmony. But your attention drifts to Sister Margaret, 3 rows ahead, whose habit seems looser than it did last month. She keeps one hand pressed against her stomach in a way that might look like devotion to anyone not paying close attention. You notice the abbess watching her too, and a chill runs through you that has nothing to do with the cold stone beneath your knees. Pregnancy was the ultimate scandal in medieval convents, the one secret that couldn't be hidden forever. The one transgression that transformed whispered rumours into undeniable proof. When nuns became pregnant, it set off a cascade of panic, conspiracy, and desperate measures that revealed just how far religious communities would go to protect their reputations. These weren't rare occurrences happening once in a lifetime. Convent pregnancy scandals erupted with alarming frequency across medieval Europe, leaving behind court records, investigation reports, and chronicles that pull back the curtain on one of the era's most closely guarded secrets. The first challenge facing a pregnant nun was simple. How long could she hide it? In a community where women lived in close quarters, shared dormitories, and often dressed and bathed together, concealing a changing body required enormous ingenuity. Some nuns wore multiple layers of clothing, claiming to feel unusually cold. Others volunteered for kitchen duty or laundry work tasks that required heavier aprons that could disguise a growing belly. A few convinced the convent's infirmarian that they suffered from bloating or dropsy, medieval terms for fluid retention, and needed to be excused from certain communal activities. One particularly resourceful French nun in the 14th century managed to hide her pregnancy for 7 months by claiming she had developed a tumour and needed to sleep in a private cell rather than the common dormitory. She wore a specially constructed corset under her habit that compressed and redistributed her shape. The deception only failed when she went into labour earlier than expected, and couldn't muffle her cries of pain. The midwife called to attend her later testified that the nun had given herself several cracked ribs from the tight binding, a detail that speaks to the desperation involved in these concealments. But what happened when the baby actually arrived? This is where convent pregnancy scandals enter truly dark territory. Some convents had what can only be described as contingency plans for dealing with unwanted infants. In 15th century Italy, investigation revealed that one convent had a long-standing arrangement with a local foundling hospital. When a nun gave birth, the baby would be secretly wrapped in anonymous clothing, placed in a basket, and left at the hospital's revolving door, a cylindrical wooden device built into the wall where parents could leave unwanted children without being seen. The system had apparently been operating for years before church authorities discovered it. Other convents relied on networks of sympathetic lay servants or local families who would take the babies and raise them as their own, sometimes for payment, sometimes out of genuine compassion. A German chronicle from the 13th century describes a washerwoman who worked for a convent and who, over the course of 15 years, helped place at least 6 babies born to nuns with farming families in the surrounding countryside. She would tell the families that the children were orphans from plague or war, and the families, needing extra hands for farm work, would accept them without asking too many questions. The most tragic outcomes involved infanticide babies who died in childbirth under suspicious circumstances, or who were born healthy but didn't survive their first night. Medieval records hint at these deaths through euphemistic language. A bishop's report might note that a child was born dead or died of natural causes shortly after birth, in cases where the circumstances suggest otherwise. One English investigation from 1441 describes finding the tiny skeleton of an infant buried in a convent garden during renovation work, wrapped in cloth that matched the convent's altar linens. Historians still argue whether such cases represent deliberate murder, deaths from neglect, or genuinely tragic natural deaths that were simply hidden to avoid scandal. Sometimes the pregnancies couldn't be hidden and the scandals exploded into public view. When this happened, the aftermath could destroy lives and reputations across entire communities. In 1364, a nun at a prominent French convent gave birth during evening prayers, her labour beginning so suddenly that she had no chance to hide. Her screams echoed through the chapel, and within minutes the entire convent knew the truth. The investigation that followed implicated not just the nun, but also the abbess and 2 other senior nuns who had known about the pregnancy and helped conceal it. All 4 were removed from the convent. The abbess was defrocked, and the convent itself lost significant properties and privileges as punishment. The identity of the fathers added additional layers of scandal to these cases. Sometimes the father was a local nobleman or merchant, the same men who'd been conducting those secret courtships we discussed earlier. But shockingly often, the fathers were clergy members, parish priests who served as confessors to the convents, chaplains who said daily mass, or bishops who conducted official visits. A Spanish investigation from 1489 revealed that a chaplain had fathered children with 3 different nuns in the same convent over a period of 5 years. He had used his position of spiritual authority to seduce them, promising that their sins would be absolved through his special intercession. The psychological manipulation involved in these cases was profound and disturbing. Some of the most explosive scandals involved multiple pregnancies at the same convent, suggesting either organised activities or a complete breakdown of discipline. In 1485, an investigation of a convent in the Netherlands discovered that 4 nuns were pregnant simultaneously. The inquiry revealed that the convent had been allowing male visitors to enter the cloister after hours, essentially turning parts of the building into a meeting place for illicit encounters. The bishop's report describes finding evidence of feasting, drinking, and dancing in the convent's parlour activities that had apparently been happening regularly for at least 2 years. The punishments for pregnant nuns varied as wildly as the circumstances of their situations. Wealthy nuns from powerful families sometimes escaped with relatively light sentences. Their families would negotiate with church authorities, make substantial donations to the diocese, and arrange for their daughters to be quietly transferred to remote convents where they could live out their lives in obscurity. One Italian nun from a banking family who became pregnant in 1456 was sent to a mountain convent so remote that it took 3 days to reach by horse. She lived there for 42 more years, never once leaving the grounds. Poor nuns without family connections faced much harsher fates. Some were expelled from religious life entirely and left to fend for themselves in a world that viewed them as fallen women. Without family support or marketable skills, many ended up in prostitution or desperate poverty. A few found shelter in Magdalene houses, institutions for penitent women, but these were harsh environments focused on punishment and redemption through labour. Other pregnant nuns were sent to particularly strict convents known for brutal discipline, where they spent years doing the hardest physical work while being subjected to regular public humiliations. Perhaps most disturbing were the cases where pregnant nuns were imprisoned within their own convents. Some convents had special penitential cells, small rooms with barred windows where disgraced nuns could be confined for months or even years. They would be brought food through a slot in the door and allowed out only for religious services, where they had to sit separately from the other nuns. A few records describe pregnant nuns being kept in these cells until they gave birth, with only minimal assistance during labour. What happened to the babies born from these situations varied enormously. Some, as mentioned, went to foundling hospitals where their chances of survival were slim. Medieval foundling hospitals had mortality rates often exceeding 50%. Others were taken in by families who raised them without knowing their true origins. A lucky few were claimed by their fathers, particularly when the fathers were noblemen who chose to acknowledge their illegitimate children. These children might be raised in the father's household alongside his legitimate offspring, though always marked by their birth status. You watch Sister Margaret now as she rises from prayer, one hand steadying herself against the pew. The abbess approaches her, speaks quietly, and Sister Margaret nods. Her face pale. They walk together toward the abbess's private chambers, and you realise an investigation is beginning. In the coming weeks there will be questions, accusations, tears, and confessions. The story will emerge piece by piece who the father is, how long the affair lasted, who else knew and said nothing. And then will come the reckoning, the punishment, the disappearance of Sister Margaret from the convent, her fate another secret whispered about in the dormitory after lights out. You stand in the grand entrance hall of a wealthy convent in 15th century England, and what you see before you bears little resemblance to your expectations of austere religious life. Rich tapestries hang on the walls depicting not just biblical scenes, but also hunting parties and courtly celebrations. The abbess sweeps past you wearing a habit made of fine black wool trimmed with fur, definitely not the rough cloth mandated by monastic rules. Through an open doorway, you glimpse a dining hall where nuns sit at tables laden with roasted meats, white bread, and wine in silver goblets. This isn't poverty, chastity, and obedience. This is wealth, power, and a lifestyle that would make many noblewomen envious. Medieval convents, particularly those housing women from aristocratic families, often functioned as economic powerhouses controlling vast estates, generating substantial income, and wielding influence that extended far beyond their cloistered walls. The romantic image of nuns living in humble poverty was exactly that romantic fiction. The reality involved property disputes, financial manipulations, legal battles, and power struggles that would fit comfortably in any modern corporate drama. These weren't just houses of prayer, they were businesses, and some nuns proved to be remarkably shrewd and sometimes ruthless businesswomen. The wealth of medieval convents came from multiple sources. When women entered religious life, they typically brought dowries with them, payments from their families to the convent in exchange for accepting their daughters. For noble families, these dowries could be enormous land, manor houses, mills, fishing rights, forests, and cold, hard cash. A single wealthy entrant could transform a convent's financial position overnight. In 1380, when Lady Eleanor de Bohun entered the Yorkshire convent, her dowry included 3 manor houses, 2 mills, 100 acres of prime farmland, and an annual payment of £20 a sum that could support a dozen nuns for a year. These dowries weren't just one-time gifts. The properties attached to them generated ongoing income through rents, tithes, and fees. A convent might own villages where peasants paid rent for their cottages, fields where tenant farmers paid a portion of their harvest, or mills where everyone in the area paid to grind their grain. By the 14th century, some English convents controlled estates spread across multiple counties, requiring sophisticated management systems to track income and expenses. The abbesses who ran these wealthy convents operated more like CEOs than spiritual leaders. They negotiated contracts, hired stewards to manage distant properties, took legal action against tenants who didn't pay rent, and made strategic decisions about investments and acquisitions. A German abbess in the 1420s became locally famous or infamous for her aggressive property acquisitions. Over 15 years, she purchased or leveraged her way into controlling 17 additional farms, 2 vineyards, and a profitable fish pond. When a neighbouring monastery complained that she was encroaching on their traditional territories, she took them to court and won. Some abbesses displayed financial creativity that bordered on genius. In 14th century France, an abbess facing a cash shortage began lending money at interest technically forbidden by church law. But she structured the loans as pious donations with expected gratitude gifts to avoid the prohibition. She essentially ran a medieval credit union from her convent, lending to local merchants and minor nobles. Within a decade, she'd built up enough capital to renovate the convent chapel and purchase 2 new properties. Church authorities eventually caught on and ordered her to stop, but not before she'd secured her convent's financial future. The lifestyle that this wealth enabled was spectacular and completely at odds with monastic ideals. Wealthy convents served elaborate meals featuring multiple courses, expensive wines, and foods like peacock and swan that were status symbols on medieval tables. A bishop's inspection report from 15th century Italy describes a convent where meals regularly included 8 courses, served on silver plates, with each nun attended by her own personal servant. The bishop was scandalised, but his attempts to impose simpler fare were ignored. The nuns essentially told him that as daughters of nobility, they maintained their right to dine according to their station. Personal servants were another luxury that wealthy nuns considered non-negotiable. Despite rules requiring nuns to perform their own work as an act of humility, aristocratic nuns brought their own maids into convents and kept them as personal attendants. Some nuns had multiple servants, one to help them dress, another to prepare their private chambers, a third to run errands, A Venetian investigation in 1509 discovered a prioress who kept a staff of 5 personal servants, while the rest of the convent shared only 3 among 30 nuns. When questioned, she explained that maintaining an appropriate household was necessary to preserve her family's dignity. The accommodations in wealthy convents reflected similar privilege. While monastic rules called for nuns to sleep in common dormitories as a sign of communal equality, many wealthy convents featured private apartments for nuns who could afford them and who came from families important enough to demand them. These weren't simple cells. A surviving inventory from an English convent describes one nun's private quarters as including a bedroom with a carved wooden bed and feather mattress, a sitting room with a fireplace and cushioned chairs, and a private garden. The nun in question also kept a small library of secular books, romances and poetry alongside her devotional texts. Pet keeping was another privilege that wealthy nuns refused to abandon. Despite repeated prohibitions from church authorities, convents became famous for their menageries of lapdogs, cats, and occasionally more exotic animals. A 1387 inspection of an English convent noted disapprovingly that the nuns kept small dogs, some of which are suffered to enter the choir and make disturbance during divine service. One French nun was reported to have the pet squirrel that she kept in her chambers and fed delicacies from the table. The bishop ordered her to get rid of it. She responded by giving it to her sister who lived in the same convent, who then kept it in her chambers instead. The financial power of these convents inevitably led to conflicts and power struggles, both internal and external. Within convents, disputes erupted over who controlled resources and how money should be spent. In some convents, the wealthiest nuns, those whose dowries had been largest, expected and received preferential treatment, creating a hierarchy that had nothing to do with spiritual merit. A German chronicle describes a convent where the upper nuns, those from prominent families, lived on a completely different standard than the lower nuns, those from lesser backgrounds, eating different food, wearing finer clothes, and enjoying private rooms while their poorer sisters slept in dormitories. These internal class divisions sometimes exploded into open conflict. In 1456, a group of poor nuns at an Italian convent formally complained to the bishop that the wealthy nuns were monopolizing resources, taking the best foods, and forcing poorer nuns to do the hardest work while they lived lives of leisure. The complaint described the wealthy nuns hosting private dinner parties in their quarters, wearing jewellery and fashionable modifications to their habits, and generally behaving like secular noblewomen. The bishop's investigation confirmed most of these charges. But his attempts at reform were largely unsuccessful. The wealthy nuns had powerful families who threatened to withdraw their financial support if their daughters faced restrictions. External conflicts were even more dramatic. Convents fought legal battles with neighbouring landowners over property boundaries, with local authorities over tax obligations, and even with other religious houses over competing claims to resources. Historians still argue whether these legal aggressions represented necessary defence of convent rights or evidence of unseemly worldliness in religious communities. An English convent in the 1390s spent 15 years in litigation with a neighbouring lord over fishing rights to a particular stream. The convent ultimately won, but only after spending enormous sums on legal fees and creating bitter enmity with local secular authorities. Some abbesses became notorious for their combative management styles. A Flemish abbess in the early 15th century gained a reputation as a holy terror who would sue at the slightest provocation, allegedly kept detailed records of every slight against a convent, and pursued vendettas against anyone she viewed as an enemy. When a local merchant's cart accidentally damaged part of the convent's wall, she took him to court and demanded compensation far exceeding the actual damage. She won the case, establishing a precedent that protected convent property, but making herself deeply unpopular in the surrounding community. You watch now as the abbess you saw earlier sits in her private chambers, reviewing account books with her steward, discussing rents collected and properties to be acquired. She signs documents with a decisive flourish, makes notes in margins, asks sharp questions about yields and expenses. This is a woman wielding real power, managing real wealth, and she's very good at it. Outside her window, the chapel bells ring for afternoon prayers, but she waves them away impatiently. Business first, devotions later. In this convent, God may be eternal, but the quarterly accounts are due next week. You're crouched in the shadows near the convent's outer wall just after midnight, watching as a rope ladder unfurls from a second-story window. A figure in dark clothing, a nun who has removed her white wimple and covered her distinctive habit with a cloak, begins her descent. Her hands shake on the rope, and halfway down she freezes, looking back up at the window as if reconsidering. Then voices drift from inside the convent, the sound of footsteps on stone, and she scrambles down the remaining distance. Dropping the last few feet and landing hard, she gathers herself, pulls her cloak tight, and disappears into the darkness. You've just witnessed the beginning of an escape, a desperate bid for freedom that may end in triumph or tragedy. Medieval convents weren't just holding places for women's bodies, they were prisons for unwanted daughters, inconvenient wives, and women whose freedom threatened family interests. And where there are prisons, there are escape attempts. The history of medieval convents is filled with dramatic breakouts, elaborate disguises, dangerous journeys, and the fierce determination of women who refused to accept the lives others had chosen for them. Some escapes succeeded spectacularly, others ended in capture, punishment, and cautionary tales told to frighten other potential runaways. The reasons women fled convents were as varied as the women themselves. Some had been forced into religious life against their will daughters, whose families couldn't afford marriage dowries, widows whose relatives wanted their property, wives whose husbands sought annulments and needed them out of the way. A heartbreaking document from 14th century France records a 13-year-old girl's testimony after she was caught trying to escape. She explained that her father had placed her in the convent after her mother's death because he was remarrying and his new wife didn't want stepchildren. The girl had spent 3 years in the convent, never taking final vows, hoping her father would change his mind. When he didn't, she decided to run. Other nuns fled because of romantic relationships, pregnancies they needed to hide, lovers they wanted to join, or simply the desire to live as married women in the secular world. Some left because they had genuine religious doubts and couldn't bear to continue living what felt like a lie. A few escaped because of abuse within their convent's cruel abbesses, harsh conditions, or conflicts with other nuns that had become unbearable. And some, frankly, just wanted adventure, freedom, and a life beyond walls that felt like they were closing in. Planning an escape required careful preparation. The most important first step was acquiring secular clothing. A nun in her distinctive habit would be recognised immediately and returned to her convent, or worse, accused of apostasy and turned over to church authorities. Some escapees smuggled in ordinary dresses piece by piece, hiding them under floorboards or in storage areas. Others had accomplices outside who brought clothes to prearranged meeting points. One resourceful German nun in the 1440s spent months unpicking and resewing her habit to create a passable secular dress hidden beneath the outer layer, which she could discard once she was clear of the convent. Timing was crucial. Most escapes happened at night when the convent slept, but not too late travellers abroad in the deep hours of night attracted attention and suspicion. The period just after midnight, when night offices had concluded but before matins at dawn, offered a window when nuns were in their dormitories and guards, if any existed, were at their drowsiest. Some convents had only elderly lay sisters or hired watchmen who could be evaded or, in some documented cases, bribed. The physical escape itself required ingenuity and often considerable courage. Some convents had crumbling walls that could be scaled, gaps in fences that could be squeezed through, or outbuildings that weren't as carefully secured as the main cloister. A Spanish nun in 1472 escaped through the convent's wine cellar, which had the external door used for deliveries. She'd stolen the key weeks earlier and had it copied by a blacksmith during a chaperoned trip to town, slipping in payment and instructions through a carefully choreographed exchange that looked like innocent conversation. Rope ladders, like the one you just witnessed, appear repeatedly in escape accounts, making one required access to materials and privacy to work both challenges in convent life. Some nuns braided together torn bedsheets. Others used rope stolen from storage rooms. A French investigation from 1401 describes discovering an elaborate rope ladder hidden in a chapel attic, made from strips of linen carefully knotted together and attached to an iron hook. 3 nuns had been planning to use it before they were betrayed by a 4th nun, who hoped to curry favour with the abbess. Many successful escapes involved accomplices, family members who had opposed the nun's enclosure in the first place, servants sympathetic to her plight, or lovers promising a new life together. These helpers provided clothing, money for travel, safe houses along escape routes, and sometimes forged documents claiming the escapee was a widow or unmarried woman travelling to join relatives. The Italian chronicle from 1461 tells of a nun whose brother, feeling guilty about his family's decision to place her in a convent, arrived one night with horses, men-at-arms, and a plan. They essentially staged a raid on the convent, overwhelming the minimal security and carrying her away before authorities could respond. The most audacious escape in medieval records involved 12 nuns who fled together from a German convent in 1489, an event that became known as the Freiburg Flight. They had conspired for months, each contributing to a collective fund, arranging for carts and horses, and coordinating their departure. On the appointed night, they left in groups of 2 and 3 through different exits to avoid raising immediate alarm, then met at a predetermined location outside town. By the time the abbess discovered them missing at morning prayers, they were miles away. Church authorities mounted an extensive search, but remarkably, 11 of the 12 were never found. Historians still argue whether they had help from reform-minded sympathisers or simply benefited from excellent planning and luck. Not all escapes succeeded. Some nuns were caught within hours, recognised by their unusual behaviour, unfamiliarity with life outside convent walls, or inability to answer basic questions about where they were going and why. One unfortunate English nun escaped successfully, travelled 40 miles, and was recognised in a tavern when she reflexively crossed herself before eating in the elaborate way taught in her convent. Someone reported her to local authorities, and she was returned within days. The consequences for captured escapees were severe and designed to terrify other potential runaways. Public whipping was common, often administered in front of the entire convent community to maximise humiliation. Some escapees were imprisoned in convent cells for months or years on reduced rations of bread and water. They might be forced to wear chains during religious services, to sleep on bare floors, or to perform the most degrading labour in the convent. A few particularly harsh abbesses ordered captured nuns to be shaved bald, destroying the long hair that medieval women considered essential to their femininity and beauty. Repeat offenders faced even worse. A French nun who escaped 3 times was eventually transferred to a notorious penitential convent where conditions were deliberately harsh. She spent the rest of her life there under constant supervision, never allowed to speak to other nuns, required to wear a special habit marking her as an apostate, and dying after 8 years of such treatment. Her story was used to frighten other nuns. This is what happens to those who reject their vows. But what of those who escaped successfully? Their fates varied enormously. Some disappeared into anonymity, taking new names and building new lives in distant cities where no one knew their histories. A few married, though such marriages were technically invalid since nuns were considered married to Christ, creating legal tangles if discovered. Others found work as servants, seamstresses or nurses, occupations where their convent educations and literacy gave them advantages. Some successful escapees left traces in historical records when they later sought official release from their vows. A German woman who escaped her convent in 1455 lived secretly in a city for 7 years, then petitioned the Pope for a formal dispensation allowing her to marry. Her petition, which survives, explains that she had been forced into the convent at age 12 against her will, had never intended to keep perpetual vows, and had lived as a good Christian outside the convent. The Pope granted her request a rare mercy that recognised the injustice of her original situation. The most famous successful escape involves Catherine von Bora, who along with 11 other nuns fled their German convent in 1523 with help from a merchant who smuggled them out hidden in herring barrels, a story that sounds absurd but is well documented. Catherine eventually married Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, and became a significant figure in the Reformation. Her escape was part of a larger wave of convent departures during the early Reformation, when thousands of nuns left religious life. Though Catherine's story is unusual, in that her escape came before widespread Protestant reforms made such departures easier. You watch now as the escaped nun from earlier reaches a crossroads outside town where a cloaked figure waits with 2 horses. They embrace briefly, mount quickly, and ride off toward the dark horizon. Will she make it? Will she build the life she dreams of? Or will she be caught and dragged back to face punishment? The night swallows them, and their story becomes one more mystery among the countless tales of medieval women who refuse to accept the boundaries others try to place around their lives. You walk through the scriptorium of a wealthy convent in 14th century Italy, where sunlight streams through tall windows onto rows of wooden desks. Nuns sit bent over manuscripts, their quills scratching across parchment. But as you look closer, you notice something unusual. Yes, some are copying biblical texts and saints' lives, the expected work of convent scribes, but others are working on different materials entirely. One nun carefully copies a Greek philosophical text that was banned decades ago. Another transcribes what appears to be alchemical formulae, complete with mysterious symbols. A third hides her work when the abbess passes, but not before you glimpse illustrations of astronomical charts that challenge official church cosmology. This scriptorium isn't just preserving approved knowledge, it's harbouring forbidden ideas. Medieval convents were supposed to be bastions of orthodox faith and approved learning. Women entered religious life to pray, to serve, and to study only these texts that would deepen their devotion to God. But behind convent walls, some of the most educated women of the Middle Ages were reading, copying, preserving, and even creating texts that church authorities would have been horrified to discover. These forbidden libraries contained mystical writings that bordered on heresy, classical pagan texts that contradicted Christian doctrine, Medical and scientific works that challenged official explanations of the natural world, and personal spiritual writings that bypassed male religious authority entirely. The presence of forbidden books in convents wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate intellectual rebellion. Many nuns came from educated noble families where learning was valued. They arrived at convents already literate, often knowing Latin, sometimes knowing additional languages like Greek or Hebrew. Their education didn't stop at the convent gate. In fact, convents provided something rare in medieval society: time and space for women to read, study, and write without the constant demands of household management and childbearing. Some nuns used this freedom to pursue knowledge wherever it led them, regardless of whether church authorities approved. The banned texts that found their way into convent libraries came through various channels. Wealthy nuns brought books from their family collections, volumes their fathers or brothers owned, but which were considered inappropriate for women's eyes. Sympathetic priests or monks who served as confessors or teachers sometimes provided access to restricted texts, either believing the nuns deserved to read them or simply not taking female intellectual curiosity seriously enough to police it. Some books were copied secretly from university libraries or monastery collections during rare opportunities when nuns travelled or when male visitors brought materials. Classical pagan literature was among the most controversial material in convent libraries. Works by Ovid filled with stories of gods seducing mortals and transforming humans into animals were officially discouraged for nuns. Yet multiple investigations discovered copies hidden in convent collections. A German bishop's inspection in 1423 uncovered not just Ovid, but also Virgil's Aeneid, Horace's poetry, and portions of Plato's dialogues. The abbess defended their presence by claiming they were needed to teach Latin grammar, but the marginal notes in the books, personal reflections, connections to Christian ideas, arguments with the texts suggested much deeper engagement. Medical and scientific texts held particular fascination for convent readers. Many convents ran infirmaries treating not just their own members, but also local poor people, giving nuns practical reasons to study medicine. But their reading went beyond practical herbalism into controversial territory. Some convents possessed copies of works by ancient physicians like Galen and Hippocrates that discussed human anatomy and reproduction in ways the Church considered immodest. A few had access to translations of Arabic medical texts that represented the cutting edge of medieval science, but came from Muslim scholars whom many Christians viewed with suspicion. Mystical and visionary writings created the most dangerous intellectual territory. The medieval church officially controlled religious authority through male clergy popes, bishops, and priests, who claimed exclusive power to interpret doctrine and mediate between humans and God. But mystical literature suggested that individuals, especially women, could experience direct divine communication without male intermediaries. Hildegard of Bingen's visions, Mechthild of Magdeburg's flowing light of divinity, and similar texts by women mystics circulated in convents, inspiring nuns to trust their own spiritual experiences. Some nuns went further, creating their own mystical writings that advance provocative theological ideas. These texts often survived precisely because they were kept within convent networks, shared among communities of religious women who understood and protected each other's intellectual experiments. A 15th century investigation of a French convent discovered a manuscript written by one of the nuns that proposed that all souls, including female souls, were equally capable of achieving perfect union with God, implicitly challenging the male church hierarchy's claims to special spiritual authority. The manuscript was confiscated and supposedly destroyed. but references to it appear in multiple contemporary accounts, suggesting copies survived. Alchemical and astrological texts represented another category of forbidden knowledge that fascinated some convent readers. Alchemy, the attempt to transmute base metals into gold and discover the secrets of matter, occupied an ambiguous position in medieval thought. Some viewed it as legitimate natural philosophy, others condemned it as dealing with demonic forces. Several investigations discovered alchemical manuscripts in convent libraries, complete with complex diagrams and formulae. Historians still argue whether nuns were conducting actual experiments or simply found the texts intellectually intriguing. Astrology was even more controversial. The Church condemned judicial astrology using stars to predict specific future events as superstition that denied God's freedom to act in the world. Yet astronomical observation and mathematical calculation of planetary positions were necessary for determining the dates of Easter and other religious festivals. Some learned nuns exploited this ambiguity to study astrology deeply. A Spanish investigation in 1467 discovered that a prioress had been casting horoscopes for members of her community, claiming to predict their spiritual futures and advise them on important decisions. When confronted, she argued she was simply applying mathematical learning to better serve God's purposes. The physical act of hiding forbidden books required considerable creativity. Some were disguised with false covers. A banned mystical text might be bound to look like an ordinary prayer book from the outside. Others were hidden in locked chests that supposedly contained valuable altar cloths or financial records. A few convents had secret rooms or hollow spaces in walls where controversial materials could be concealed during inspections. One German convent developed an elaborate system where forbidden books were stored in the infirmary and labelled as medical texts. Since male inspectors were reluctant to closely examine materials related to women's bodies and illnesses, personal notebooks and journals kept by individual nuns often contained the most radical ideas. These weren't meant for wide circulation, and therefore escaped some of the self-censorship that affected more public writings. An Italian nun's notebook from the 1440s, discovered during a 19th century archive survey, contains her personal theological reflections that border on pantheism, the idea that God exists in all natural things rather than as the separate supernatural being. She questions whether hell is eternal, suggests that all religions might contain partial truths, and wonders whether animals have souls. These were dangerous thoughts that could lead to accusations of heresy if discovered. The intellectual networks among convents facilitated the spread of forbidden ideas. Nuns transferred between convents, carrying books and ideas with them. Letters between convents sometimes included coded references to texts or ideas that recipients would understand but external censors would miss. A network of reform-minded convents in 15th century Germany appears to have deliberately circulated mystical texts that emphasize personal spiritual experience over institutional authority, creating a kind of underground theological movement that anticipated some Protestant Reformation ideas by decades. Reading forbidden books was one thing, being caught with them was another. The consequences varied depending on what was found, who found it, and the political circumstances. Sometimes bishops ordered the offensive books destroyed and imposed penances on the nuns who possessed them. Other times, particularly when the nuns came from powerful families, authorities might confiscate texts but take no further action. In a few cases, investigations of forbidden libraries escalated into full heresy inquiries that could end in excommunication or worse. But the risks didn't stop determined readers. The very act of prohibiting texts made them more intriguing to intellectually curious minds. A banned book promised insights that authorities wanted hidden, ideas too powerful or too true to be allowed free circulation. For nuns whose lives were already constrained by countless rules about behaviour, dress, and activity, intellectual freedom became a space where they could exercise autonomy. No one could control what happened inside their minds when they read forbidden words late at night by candlelight. You watch now as the nun with the astronomical charts carefully returns her manuscript to its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. She slides an ordinary devotional text onto her desk just as the abbess walks past, nodding approvingly at the visible pious work. The abbess has no idea that beneath her feet lies a collection of texts that would provoke scandal if discovered, a personal library of forbidden knowledge accumulated over years of careful acquisition. Tonight, after Compline, the nun will retrieve her hidden manuscript again and continue her studies, pushing at the boundaries of what she is allowed to know, refusing to accept that wisdom has limits imposed by others. You're sitting in the refectory of a French convent during the evening meal, the clatter of wooden spoons against bowls echoing off stone walls. The nuns eat in silence, as required, while one of their sisters reads aloud from the lives of saints. But you notice something strange about the food. The prioress's bowl contains a different stew than everyone else's. Hers looks richer, with visible chunks of meat. She eats slowly, methodically, never taking her eyes off the abbess who sits at the head table. The abbess, for her part, barely touches her meal, pushing pieces around her bowl with apparent distaste. 3 days from now, the abbess will fall violently ill. A week after that, she'll be dead, and the prioress will ascend to power in her place, though whispers will follow her for years about what really happened in that refectory. Poison was the weapon of choice for medieval power struggles within convents, where women lacked access to swords or the ability to settle disputes through open violence. Behind the peaceful facade of religious life, some convents harboured bitter rivalries, contested successions, and feuds that turned deadly when ambition, jealousy, or desperation pushed certain nuns past moral boundaries. Poison offered a solution subtle, deniable, and if done carefully, almost untraceable. The historical record preserves chilling accounts of suspected poisonings, mysterious deaths, and investigations that reveal the dark side of communal religious life. The closed nature of convent communities made them perfect environments for poisoning. Everyone ate together from communal kitchens. The sick were tended by sister nuns who prepared their medicines. Trust was assumed among women who had taken vows together, and the limited medical knowledge of the era made distinguishing between natural illness and deliberate poisoning extremely difficult. Many deaths that might have been poisonings were recorded simply as sudden illness, food sickness, or God's mysterious will, leaving us to wonder how many crimes went undetected. Access to poisons wasn't difficult for educated convent women. Every convent maintained an infirmary stocked with medicinal herbs, many of which were toxic in the wrong doses. Foxglove could strengthen a failing heart or stop a healthy one. Hemlock treated spasms or caused paralysis and death. Belladonna dilated pupils for eye treatments, or induced delirium and respiratory failure. The nun in charge of the infirmary, the infirmarian, possessed knowledge that could heal or kill, and in several documented cases, that knowledge was turned to murder. One of the most extensively documented poisoning cases occurred in a German convent in 1472. The victim was an elderly abbess who had led her community for 20 years, but had recently become unpopular due to her strict enforcement of rules and refusal to grant privileges to wealthy nuns. She began experiencing symptoms that contemporary accounts describe as severe stomach pains, vomiting, and weakness. Her condition improved when she rested, then worsened when she returned to normal activities. After 3 months of this pattern, she died, The bishop who investigated her death questioned the infirmarian, who eventually confessed under pressure that she'd been gradually adding small amounts of arsenic to the abbess's food, not enough to cause immediate death, but sufficient to slowly destroy her health. The infirmarian claimed she had acted alone, but the investigation revealed a conspiracy. 3 other nuns, including the sub-prioress who stood to gain from the abbess's death, had known about the poisoning and actively encouraged it. They had provided the infirmarian with money to purchase additional arsenic from an apothecary in town, coached her on how to administer it without arousing suspicion, and covered for her when questions arose about the abbess's illness. All 4 were convicted. The infirmarian was handed over to secular authorities and executed. The others were imprisoned in separate convents for life. Arsenic appears repeatedly in convent poisoning cases because it was relatively easy to obtain. It was used in pest control, in certain medicines, and in manufacturing, and its symptoms could be mistaken for various natural illnesses. White arsenic powder was tasteless and could be mixed into food or wine without detection. In measured doses over time, it caused symptoms that looked like wasting disease or digestive disorders. Only when someone died suddenly after a large dose, or when a pattern of deaths occurred in suspicious circumstances. Would authorities investigate? Not all suspected poisonings were proven. An Italian convent in 1445 experienced 3 deaths within 6 months, all previously healthy nuns who fell ill suddenly and died within days. Rumour spread that the deaths were connected to a contested election for prioress that had divided the community into bitter factions. The bishop launched an investigation, interrogated dozens of nuns, and examined the convent's food preparation procedures. He concluded that poisoning was likely, but could never identify a perpetrator or prove his suspicions. The case remained officially unsolved, though it destroyed the convent's reputation and led to several nuns requesting transfers elsewhere. The motives behind convent poisonings varied widely. Some were straightforward power grabs, eliminating rivals for leadership positions that brought prestige, better living conditions, and control over resources. Others stemmed from personal hatreds that festered in the forced intimacy of convent life. Imagine spending decades living with someone you despised, eating together, praying together, never able to escape their presence. For some medieval nuns, murder must have seemed like the only way to free themselves from intolerable situations. Financial motives also played a role. When a nun died, her personal possessions and any income from her dowries properties reverted to the convent's common fund. But sometimes specific nuns had claims on these resources or stood to benefit from redistributions. A Spanish investigation in 1489 examined the death of a wealthy nun whose sister also lived in the same convent. The dead woman had been slowly transferring portions of her family's generous endowment to fund her sister's private quarters and luxuries. After her death, questions arose about whether the sister had hastened that death to gain full control of the remaining resources. The investigation proved inconclusive, but the sister was quietly transferred to another convent, a punishment suggesting authorities suspected guilt even if they couldn't prove it. Some poisoning cases involved not murder but attempted murder that failed, leaving behind terrified victims and clear evidence of intent. An English case from 1411 involved a nun who became violently ill after drinking wine that was later found to have been tampered with. She survived, and an investigation traced the poisoned wine to another nun with whom she had been feuding over a property dispute. The would-be poisoner had apparently mixed monkshood, a deadly plant, into the wine, but hadn't used a lethal dose. She was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in a penitential cell within the convent walls. The psychological dynamics of poisoning suited the constraints of convent life in disturbing ways. Unlike violent murder, Poisoning allowed the killer to maintain a facade of innocence and continue living among her victims. The poisoner could tend her victim's sickbed with apparent compassion, pray publicly for her recovery, and express shock at her death. This duplicity required extraordinary coldness, but several cases suggest that some nuns possessed exactly that trait. A French prioress investigated in 1467 was described by a community as having a heart of ice. She had allegedly poisoned a rival, then led prayers for the deceased, then pushed aggressively for the leadership position the death had opened, all without visible guilt or hesitation. Detection methods for poisoning were primitive by modern standards, but medieval investigators weren't completely helpless. Sudden deaths of previously healthy people raised suspicion. Patterns of similar symptoms in multiple victims suggested common causes. Authorities questioned convent members about feuds, motives, and access to the victim's food or drink. In some cases, they examined the victim's body for signs of poisoning, though medieval understanding of pathology was limited. A few investigations involved primitive toxicology, feeding suspect food or drink to animals to see if they became ill or died. The presence of physicians or medical knowledge in investigations could prove crucial. In 1456, an Italian nobleman's daughter died in her convent under suspicious circumstances. Her family, unwilling to accept that she died of natural causes at age 23, hired a physician to examine the evidence. His report noted that her symptoms, severe abdominal pain, vomiting, and bloody diarrhea, were consistent with certain plant poisons. He identified monkshood or hellebore as likely culprits. This medical opinion gave the family grounds to demand a fuller investigation, which eventually implicated a nun who had access to the infirmary's stores and a motive related to a romantic rivalry. Historians still argue whether the evidence in this case was solid, or whether family pressure forced investigators to find a scapegoat. The sentences for convicted poisoners were invariably severe. Secular authorities, who often took jurisdiction in murder cases even when they occurred in convents, frequently imposed death penalties, execution by hanging, burning, or in a few cases, being buried alive, which was a punishment sometimes used specifically for poisoners. Church authorities preferred perpetual imprisonment, often in conditions so harsh that it amounted to a slow death sentence. Some convicted poisoners were sent to isolated monastery prisons, where they spent the rest of their lives in solitary confinement, speaking to no one, seeing no one except the person who brought their daily bread and water. Beyond individual murders, there are hints in medieval records of something even darker: serial poisoning. A Spanish convent experienced 7 deaths over 3 years in the early 1500s, all with similar symptoms. An investigation finally revealed that the infirmarian had been systematically poisoning nuns she didn't like, selecting victims she thought wouldn't be missed or whose deaths could be explained as natural. She'd killed at least 5, possibly all 7, before being caught. Her trial records describe her as showing no remorse, claiming that she was ridding the convent of troublesome members who disrupted its peace. She was executed by burning, her ashes scattered to prevent any burial or memorial. You watch the prioress now as she finishes her meal and rises from the table, offering a prayer for the community. Her face shows perfect pious composure, her voice steady and clear. In 3 days, when the abbess falls ill, the prioress will be the one who tends her most devotedly, bringing her special broths and medicines. And when the abbess dies, the prioress will weep convincingly at her funeral before accepting the community's election to replace her. The truth will remain buried like so many convent secrets, hidden behind walls and silence, known only to God and the killer who kneels in prayer each night. You're walking through the cloister garden on a warm summer evening when you notice two nuns sitting together on a stone bench beneath an apple tree. Their heads lean close together, their hands clasped between them. One reaches up to tuck a strand of hair back under the other's veil, her fingers lingering on her companion's cheek. They're whispering to each other with an intimacy that makes you pause, that makes you realise this isn't the affection of ordinary sisters in Christ. This is something deeper, something forbidden, something that could destroy both their lives if discovered. You step back into the shadows, giving them their moment of stolen privacy, knowing that elsewhere in this convent, suspicious eyes are watching, and that investigations into such relationships can turn brutal. Same-sex relationships between nuns existed throughout the medieval period, though they were rarely discussed openly and were met with horror and severe punishment when discovered. The Church taught that such relationships were unnatural sins, violations of both religious vows and divine law, yet the very structure of convent life women, living together in intimate proximity for years or decades, sharing sleeping quarters, spending countless hours in each other's company, created conditions where deep emotional and physical bonds naturally formed. Some of these bonds crossed the line from friendship into romance and sexuality, creating scandals that church authorities investigated with disturbing thoroughness. The documentary evidence for lesbian relationships in medieval convents is fragmentary and filtered through the hostile perspectives of male investigators, but enough survives to reveal patterns. Investigation reports describe nuns who refused to sleep apart from particular companions, who exchanged gifts and love tokens, who were caught in compromising positions. Some records use euphemistic language, particular friendships, or inappropriate attachments, while others are shockingly explicit in describing what investigators claim to have witnessed or extracted through interrogation. One of the most detailed cases comes from a German convent in 1477, where a bishop's investigation revealed a relationship between two nuns that had lasted for 8 years. The women had requested to share a cell, claiming they worked well together on embroidery projects. In reality, they had created a private space where they could be together without constant supervision. The investigation began when another nun, motivated by jealousy or genuine moral outrage, reported seeing them in bed together. The subsequent inquiry forced both women to confess to what the record describes as carnal knowledge of each other and acts against nature. The interrogation methods used in these cases were often invasive and humiliating. Male clergy would question nuns in graphic detail about their physical relationships, demanding descriptions of specific acts. Some investigations included physical examinations by midwives or physicians, looking for evidence of sexual activity examinations based on medieval misconceptions about female anatomy, but traumatic nonetheless. The stated goal was to determine the severity of the sin and appropriate punishment, but the process itself functioned as punishment, designed to shame and break the accused women. The theological framework that condemned same-sex relationships between nuns rested on several foundations. First, nuns had taken vows of chastity that forbade all sexual activity. Any violation of those vows was serious, but same-sex acts were considered especially grave because they served no procreative purpose. They were purely about pleasure, which medieval theology viewed with deep suspicion. Second, such acts were classified as sodomy, a term that encompassed various non-procreative sexual behaviours and carried associations with the biblical destruction of Sodom. Third, these relationships challenged gender hierarchies by creating partnerships between equals rather than the husband-wife dynamic that medieval society viewed as natural and divinely ordained. Despite the severe prohibitions, evidence suggests these relationships occurred with some frequency. A A Spanish investigation in 1495 examined accusations at a convent where multiple same-sex relationships had allegedly developed. The inquiry revealed a subculture within the convent where certain nuns formed exclusive partnerships, defending each other against outsiders and creating their own social hierarchy separate from official convent structures. The investigators were shocked to discover that these relationships were semi-open secrets within the community. Many nuns knew about them but had remained silent, either out of sympathy, fear of the accused women, or reluctance to invite external authorities into convent affairs. The language that survives in medieval documents hints at how women in these relationships understood them. Some letters exchanged between nuns use the conventions of courtly love poetry, addressing each other with romantic endearments typically associated with heterosexual courtship. One Italian nun's letter, confiscated during a 14th century investigation, addresses her beloved as my heart's treasure and the light that guides my darkness, language that parallels secular love letters of the period. Whether these women saw themselves as violating their vows or found ways to reconcile their relationships with their religious commitments remains unclear. We hear their voices only through hostile documentation. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood same-sex desire between women the same way modern culture understands lesbianism. The medieval framework focused on acts rather than identities. There was no concept of being lesbian as an orientation or identity category. Instead, authorities condemned specific behaviours while remaining somewhat uncertain about whether women could actually commit true sodomy without male anatomy involved. This theological confusion sometimes worked in accused women's favour, allowing them to argue that their relationships, while inappropriate, weren't as serious as the worst sexual sins. Some investigations reveal that nuns developed elaborate justifications for their relationships. They might claim they were practicing spiritual friendship of the kind praised in religious literature, just taken to unfortunate physical extremes. Or they'd argue that their deep love for each other reflected divine love and was therefore holy rather than sinful. A few particularly bold defendants turned the accusations back on their investigators, suggesting that male clergy were so obsessed with sexual sin that they saw it where innocent affection existed. These defences rarely succeeded in avoiding punishment, but they reveal women trying to control their own narratives even in impossible circumstances. The penalties for convicted nuns varied but were consistently harsh. Both partners in a relationship might be subjected to public penance, appearing before the convent community in penitential garments, confessing their sins aloud, receiving ritual beatings or other corporal punishments. They would be permanently separated, sometimes sent to different convents to prevent any continued contact. In extreme cases, they might be imprisoned in convent cells, relegated to performing the most degrading tasks, or even expelled from religious life entirely. The social death that followed conviction could be as destructive as physical punishment. Other nuns would be forbidden from speaking to the convicted women except when necessary. They would eat separately, pray in designated spaces, and be excluded from community activities. This isolation could last months, years, or the rest of their lives. The goal was to make them examples that would discourage others from forming similar attachments. But it also reveals the cruelty that religious communities could inflict on their own members when moral panic took hold. Some nuns managed to hide their relationships successfully for years or even decades. They learned to be discreet, to mask their feelings in public, to create cover stories for time spent together. They developed coded language and gestures that allowed them to communicate affection without alerting suspicious observers. A few couples survived multiple investigations by steadfastly denying all accusations and maintaining that their friendship was purely spiritual. without physical evidence or credible witnesses. Even hostile investigators sometimes had to abandon cases. The role of other nuns in these dramas, the ones who reported relationships, who testified in investigations, or who remained silent, is complicated. Some informants acted from genuine moral conviction, believing they were protecting their community from sin. Others were motivated by personal grudges, jealousy, or desire to curry favour with authorities. Many nuns undoubtedly knew about relationships, but chose silence, either because they sympathised with the women involved, or because they feared the disruption that investigations brought. This created communities fractured by secrets, suspicions, and competing loyalties. A few rare documents hint at convent cultures where same-sex relationships were tolerated or even quietly accepted as long as they remained discreet. An abbess writing to a bishop in 1432 responded to concerns about particular friendships in her convent by essentially arguing that such bonds were inevitable when women lived together for decades, that they caused no real harm to the community, and that excessive scrutiny would create more problems than it solved. The bishop was not persuaded, but her letter suggests that not all female religious authorities shared male clergy's obsessive concern with policing these relationships. The psychological toll on women caught between their feelings and their religious commitments must have been immense. They had entered convents often without real choice, had taken vows they were expected to keep for life, and then found themselves experiencing desires that their faith condemned utterly. Some internalized this condemnation, viewing themselves as sinful and struggling constantly against temptation. Others apparently found ways to compartmentalize, maintaining their relationships while still considering themselves good Christians. A few seem to have rejected the Church's teachings altogether, though expressing such rejection openly would have been extraordinarily dangerous. You watch the two women in the garden now as they reluctantly separate, knowing that evening prayers will begin soon and they must appear properly distant in public. They rise from their bench, smooth their habits, and walk toward the chapel separately, maintaining appropriate space between them. But their eyes meet one last time, holding a conversation that needs no words. Tomorrow they'll find another stolen moment, another brief respite from loneliness and pretense, and they'll continue this dangerous game until time or fate or suspicious eyes force their secret into the light. You're attending a formal church service where the local bishop is visiting the convent, and you expect to see nuns in their proper habits, plain black or brown wool, simple white wimples, no ornamentation. Instead, you're stunned by what processes past you. Several nuns wear veils made of silk rather than linen, dyed in fashionable colours rather than the required white. You catch glints of gold brooch here, a ring there, even what appears to be a delicate necklace peeking from beneath one nun's wimple. One younger nun has clearly plucked her eyebrows into fashionable arches, and another's cheeks show the telltale flush of rouge. At the end of the procession, a small white dog with a jewelled collar trots alongside its owner, a prioress who seems completely unbothered by the bishop's increasingly thunderous expression. This isn't a convent, it's a fashion show. The history of medieval nuns and their clothing is a history of constant rebellion against rules designed to make them invisible, uniform and humble. Church authorities issued regulation after regulation demanding simple dress, but nuns, particularly those from noble families, refused to abandon the markers of status and beauty they'd grown up with. The resulting battles over fashion, jewellery, cosmetics, hairstyles, and even pet ownership reveal a fundamental tension women who were supposed to renounce worldly vanity, but who couldn't quite let go of the pleasure of looking good and the social power that came with visible wealth. The basic monastic habit was supposed to be deliberately ugly and uncomfortable. a constant reminder of the wearer's rejection of worldly values. Rough wool that scratched the skin, shapeless cuts that hid the body's form, colours black, brown, or undyed grey that signalled humility. The wimple and veil covered all hair and much of the face, eliminating one of medieval women's primary beauty assets. In theory, when a woman took her vows, she was choosing to become invisible, to erase her individual identity and feminine appeal in favour of collective devotion to God. In practice, many nuns treated these rules as suggestions to be creatively interpreted. The most common violation involved fabric quality. While rules specified rough wool or plain linen, wealthy nuns imported fine fabric, soft wool from England, linen so finely woven it felt like silk, an actual silk for veils and undergarments. A bishop's visitation to a French convent in 1387 resulted in a scandalised report describing nuns wearing habits made of cloth so expensive that a common woman could not afford even a small piece for a handkerchief. The abbess defended this by arguing that as noble women, they needed to maintain appearances appropriate to their station. The bishop was unmoved, but his orders to change were largely ignored. Colour represented another battleground. Black and white were the standard convent colours, symbolising death to the world and spiritual purity. But nuns found ways to introduce colour through linings that would flash when they moved, through coloured threads in embroidery on their habits, and most blatantly, through coloured veils. Blue was particularly popular. It was associated with the Virgin Mary, and therefore could be justified as devotional. But it was also simply fashionable and flattering. A Spanish investigation in 1456 discovered that nearly every nun in a particular convent owned at least one coloured veil, which they wore on feast days and special occasions despite repeated prohibitions. Jewellery was explicitly forbidden. Nuns had symbolically married Christ and wore only a simple ring to represent that union. Yet investigation after investigation uncovered nuns wearing additional rings, brooches to fasten their veils, decorative belts, and necklaces. Some of this jewellery had genuine sentimental value pieces inherited from mothers or given as farewell gifts when entering the convent, but much of it was simply fashion, purchased by the nuns or given by admirers. A German visitation in 1423 required nuns to surrender all unauthorized jewellery. The collection filled 2 large chests and included items set with precious stones that must have cost small fortunes. The most shocking violations involved cosmetics and body modification. Church teaching held that altering one's God-given appearance was sinful vanity. Nonetheless, multiple investigations discovered nuns using rouge to redden their cheeks, powders to whiten their skin, and preparations to darken their eyelashes. Some plucked their hairlines to create the fashionably high foreheads of the era. A few even bleached the hair blonde, a time-consuming process involving lye and hours in the sun, despite the fact that the hair was supposedly hidden beneath wimples and veils. An English bishop's register from 1441 contains a remarkable letter he sent to a convent after a visitation revealed widespread cosmetic use. He wrote that he had observed nuns with painted faces that would shame a woman of the streets, and demanded immediate cessation of all such practices. He was particularly outraged by evidence that older nuns were teaching younger ones how to apply cosmetics, creating what he called a school of vanity where there should be a school of virtue. His letter had little effect. A follow-up visitation 5 years later found the same practices continuing. Hairstyles provided another avenue for self-expression, despite the requirement that hair be completely covered. Some nuns styled their hair elaborately, even though only other nuns would see it when they dressed or bathed. A few were caught arranging their wimples and veils in ways that allowed small amounts of hair to show particularly fashionable curls arranged on the forehead. One particularly bold group of French nuns in the 1460s began wearing their veils pinned back in a style that revealed their temples and ears, arguing that the heat made fuller covering unbearable. The local bishop ordered them to cover properly. They complied when he was present, but returned to their preferred style as soon as he left. Pet ownership became one of the most contentious fashion-related issues. Small dogs were fashionable accessories among noble ladies, and nuns from aristocratic families saw no reason to give up their pets. These weren't working dogs, they were lap dogs, often expensive breeds, that served no purpose except companionship and status display. They wore decorative collars, ate special food, and sometimes even attended religious services with their owners. Church authorities hated this practice, issuing prohibition after prohibition, but nuns simply ignored them. The arguments nuns made in defence of their pets are remarkably similar to modern pet ownership justifications. They claimed the animals provided comfort during difficult times, that caring for them taught compassion, that their presence made the convent feel less isolated and cold. One abbess, when ordered to remove all dogs from her convent, wrote back that the elderly nuns particularly relied on their pets for warmth at night and companionship during the day, and that removing them would be an act of cruelty. She kept her dogs, so did everyone else. Birds were another popular pet choice, songbirds in cages that provided entertainment and beauty. Some convents kept more exotic animals. An Italian investigation discovered that one wealthy nun kept a small monkey, which she dressed in tiny clothes and allowed to roam freely in her private chambers. When questioned, she claimed it was a reminder of God's creative diversity. The investigators were not persuaded and ordered the monkey removed, though records suggest she simply gave it to another nun in the same convent who kept it hidden more carefully. The motivations behind these fashion violations were complex. Partly they reflected genuine difficulty in abandoning lifetime habits women who had grown up with jewellery, fine clothes, and beauty rituals struggled to live without them. Partly they were assertions of social status, noble nuns refusing to be made indistinguishable from lower-class members of their communities. And partly they were simple human vanity and the pleasure of looking attractive, which didn't disappear just because vows were taken. Some historians view these fashion rebellions as trivial evidence that wealthy nuns were insufficiently serious about their vocations. Others see them as meaningful resistance to rules designed by men to control and diminish women. The nuns themselves probably didn't think in such political terms. They simply wanted to look nice, to feel good about their appearance, to maintain connections to the fashionable world they'd known before entering religious life. In a restricted existence with few pleasures, the small vanities of a coloured veil or a piece of jewellery took on outsized importance. The persistence of these violations despite constant prohibitions reveals the limits of church authority. Bishops could write angry letters, issue commands, and threaten punishments, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. Once they left after a visitation, convent life returned to its normal patterns, and if an entire community of nuns decided that certain rules were unreasonable, there was little authorities could practically do. They couldn't imprison everyone or shut down convents that were otherwise functioning. The irony is that these fashion-conscious nuns were probably among the most visible and remarked upon women in their communities. In trying to maintain their beauty and status, they defeated one purpose of the monastic habit, to make its wearer invisible and unremarkable. Instead, they became spectacles, objects of gossip and criticism, Women who drew attention precisely because they refused to efface themselves. Whether they would have viewed this as victory or failure is impossible to know. You watch now as the service concludes, and the nuns process out past the furious bishop. The young nun with the plucked eyebrows catches your eye and gives the tiniest smile, not quite rebellious, not quite apologetic, just a flicker of shared amusement. She knows she looks good. She knows the bishop is outraged, and she knows that tomorrow she'll put on the same fashionable veil, the same subtle rouge, and the same small rebellion against rules that try to make her invisible. Some battles, her smile suggests, are worth fighting every single day. You're kneeling in the convent chapel during morning prayers when you notice Sister Beatrice's behaviour growing strange. Her eyes roll back, her body begins to tremble, and she falls to the stone floor, convulsing. The other nuns rush to her side, but she doesn't seem to see them. Her voice, when she speaks, sounds distant and otherworldly. She claims the Virgin Mary is standing before her, radiating golden light, delivering messages about the convent's future. The abbess watches with an expression you can't quite read. Is it awe or scepticism later? You'll learn that Sister Beatrice has been having these visions for months, and that they've brought her considerable attention, special privileges, and exemption from normal duties. You'll also learn that 3 other nuns have begun experiencing similar visions, and that investigators are coming to determine whether these are genuine divine communications or elaborate frauds. Visions and miracles held tremendous power in medieval religious culture. A nun who experienced genuine divine revelation could become famous, attract pilgrims and donations, influence important decisions, and even gain a degree of independence from normal religious authority. The Church recognized certain women as genuine mystics, and visionaries Hildegard of Bingen, Catherine of Siena, Bridget of Sweden, whose spiritual experiences were validated and celebrated. But this created an opportunity for manipulation. Some nuns faked visions and miracles, either consciously crafting deceptions or convincing themselves of experiences that never occurred, to gain influence, escape punishment, or simply make their restricted lives more interesting. The line between genuine religious experience and deliberate fraud was impossibly blurry. Medieval people believed absolutely in the possibility of divine visions, demonic possessions, and miraculous interventions. There was no clear way to distinguish a real vision from a false one, a genuine miracle from a clever trick. Church authorities developed tests and criteria, but these were subjective and could be manipulated by someone who understood what investigators wanted to hear. This ambiguity created space for nuns to claim supernatural experiences that advanced their interests, while remaining nearly impossible to definitively disprove. The most common type of manipulative vision involved messages from God, Mary, or saints that conveniently supported the visionary's position on controversial issues. If a nun opposed her abbess's policies, she might experience a vision in which Mary expressed displeasure with those policies. If she wanted resources allocated to a particular project, Christ might appear to her requesting exactly that allocation. A French nun in 1445 claimed to have received a vision instructing that she should be elected the next prioress, a remarkably convenient divine intervention that undermined her rival's candidacy. The investigation that followed couldn't prove the vision false, but noted suspiciously that it perfectly aligned with the visionary's worldly ambitions. Some visionary nuns developed reputations that brought them considerable practical benefits. They might be excused from manual labour because their spiritual work was considered more important. They could receive better food to maintain their strength for their demanding mystical experiences. They gained audiences with abbesses and bishops who wanted to hear their revelations. They received gifts from lay people who hoped their prayers and intercessions would be especially powerful. For a clever nun, visions could transform a position of powerlessness into one of influence and relative comfort. The physical manifestations of visions, trances, ecstasies, speaking in tongues, stigmata could be genuine psychological experiences or could be performed. Some nuns probably experienced real dissociative states or seizures that they and others interpreted as spiritual. Others learned to fake convincing trances, controlling their breathing and eye movements to appear unconscious while remaining aware enough to speak divine messages. A few investigations describe nuns who were caught rehearsing their ecstatic performances, practicing the physical movements and verbal revelations they would later present as spontaneous divine communications. Stigmata wounds resembling Christ's crucifixion injuries represented the most dramatic miracle a nun could claim. Genuine stigmata would be powerful proof of sanctity, but several medieval investigations uncovered nuns who had created fake stigmata using various methods. Some simply cut themselves, then claimed the wounds appeared spontaneously during prayer. Others used dyes or pig's blood to create the appearance of bleeding wounds that would wash away after inspection. A German case from 1453 involved a nun whose stigmata were revealed to be painted on with a mixture of red ochre and animal blood, discovered only when an alert physician noticed the wounds smeared rather than bled when touched. Prophecies offered another avenue for manipulative visionaries. A nun might claim divine revelation about future events, then work behind the scenes to make those predictions come true, enhancing her reputation as a genuine prophet. If she predicted conflict between two convent factions, she could subtly encourage that conflict. If she foresaw a benefactor making a generous donation, she might have already negotiated that donation through normal channels before announcing her vision. The self-fulfilling prophecy was a powerful tool for building credibility. Some nuns claimed visions that served primarily to excuse their own misconduct. If caught breaking rules, a visionary might claim she'd been commanded by divine revelation to do so, putting investigators in the difficult position of either accepting her explanation or accusing her of lying about messages from God. A Spanish nun caught outside her convent claimed an angel had told her she needed to make a pilgrimage. Her defenders argued that disobeying an angel would be a worse sin than breaking enclosure. The investigation concluded she had invented the vision to justify a forbidden visit to her family, but proving this required months of interrogation. The theological justifications for disobedience based on private revelation could be sophisticated. Some visionary nuns argued that direct divine communication superseded human religious authority if God told them to do something. They were obligated to obey regardless of what abbesses or bishops commanded. This was a radical and dangerous claim that undermined the entire hierarchical structure of the Church, and authorities fought against it vigorously. Yet it couldn't be entirely dismissed without denying the possibility of genuine mystical experience, which was too central to medieval Christianity. Investigations into suspected false visions were complex affairs. Bishops or their representatives would interrogate the visionary at length, asking detailed questions about what she saw, heard, and felt. They would consult theologians about whether the content of visions aligned with orthodox doctrine. They would interview other nuns about the visionary's character, behaviour, and possible motives for deception. They might test the visionary by asking her to predict future events, or to produce miracles on demand tests that genuine mystics sometimes refused on the grounds that God couldn't be commanded to perform. Physical examinations were part of many investigations. Physicians would inspect stigmata for signs of self-harm or fakery. They would observe visionaries during claimed ecstasies, sometimes using painful stimuli to see if the supposedly unconscious nun reacted. Some investigations involved keeping the visionary under constant observation for days or weeks to see if supernatural phenomena continued when she had no privacy to stage them. These methods occasionally exposed frauds, but could also traumatize genuine mystics or women experiencing psychological crises. The punishments for proven false visionaries were severe, both as personal penalties and as warnings to others. Convicted frauds might be imprisoned, subjected to public penances, or transferred to harsh penitential institutions. Their reputations were destroyed, and they were held up as cautionary examples of prideful women who claimed divine favour they didn't possess. A French nun convicted of faking visions in 1467 was required to stand before her community and confess her deception in detail, describing exactly how she had manufactured her trances and composed her divine messages. The humiliation was designed to be unforgettable. But many suspected false visionaries were never definitively proven guilty or innocent. Investigations would conclude ambiguously, noting concerns about the vision's authenticity but unable to provide definitive proof of fraud. These nuns existed in a liminal space neither validated as genuine mystics nor condemned as frauds. Some continued having visions that a portion of their community believed and another portion doubted. The uncertainty itself served church authorities' purposes, creating caution about accepting visionary claims too readily, while avoiding the scandal of definitively exposing prominent holy women as charlatans. Historians still argue about how to interpret medieval visionary nuns. Were most genuine mystics having real psychological or spiritual experiences? Were many deliberate manipulators gaming a system that rewarded supernatural claims? The truth probably includes both, plus a large middle category of women who half believed their own embellishments, who experienced something unusual and then shaped and elaborated it into something more dramatic, who convinced themselves of visions that began as imagination or dreams. The medieval mind didn't make sharp distinctions between imagination and perception, between hoped-for experiences and actual events in the way modern psychology does. What's clear is that visions provided one of the few sources of power available to medieval nuns, through claims of divine communication. Powerless women could influence decisions, gain attention and respect, and carve out spaces of autonomy in highly controlled environments. Whether any particular vision was genuine, manipulated, or entirely fabricated, the system itself created incentives for visionary claims and made definitively distinguishing truth from performance nearly impossible. Some nuns undoubtedly exploited this system cynically. Others probably believed their own experiences while unconsciously shaping them to serve their needs. You watch Sister Beatrice now, recovering from her vision, being helped to her feet by concerned sisters. She looks genuinely exhausted, her face pale, her hands trembling. Is this the aftermath of a profound spiritual experience, or simply good acting? You realize you can't tell, and neither can anyone else in this room. That ambiguity is precisely what makes her vision so powerful and so dangerous. Tomorrow she'll have another vision, and the day after that another, each one expanding her influence and the questions surrounding her, until eventually investigators come, and everyone will have to choose what they believe. You stand before the imposing gates of a wealthy convent in 15th century Florence, watching as a young woman arrives in her elaborate carriage, accompanied by servants carrying trunks of belongings. She perhaps 16 years old, dressed in expensive secular clothing, and her face shows no sign of religious devotion, only resignation and barely suppressed anger. Her father walks beside her, his expression a mixture of relief and guilt, You already know this girl's story because you've seen it play out dozens of times. She's not here because she's chosen religious life. She's here because her family has chosen it for her. Her dowry couldn't compete with her prettier sisters. Her mother died and her father remarried. Her behaviour was too independent, her opinions too outspoken, her interests too unsuitable for a proper noble daughter, so she's been locked away, not for her sins, but for her family's convenience. Medieval convents served a dark secondary function beyond their religious purpose. They were prisons for inconvenient women. Families used them to dispose of daughters they couldn't or wouldn't marry, to silence women who knew dangerous secrets, to remove rivals for inheritances, and to solve problems that aristocratic families couldn't address through normal social channels. These weren't women who had vocations or who wanted religious life. They were prisoners, forced into permanent enclosure by families who had the legal right to make that choice for them. And where there were unwilling prisoners, there were eventually rebellions. The mechanisms that allowed families to imprison daughters in convents were entirely legal and socially accepted. Parents had enormous authority over their children's lives, including the right to determine whether they should marry or enter religious life. A girl as young as 12 could be placed in a convent, begin her novitiate, and take vows that would bind her for life, all without anyone asking whether she genuinely chose this path. The system assumed that parents acted in their children's best interests, and that religious life was honourable regardless of how one entered it. The financial arrangements made convents willing participants in this system. When a family placed an unwilling daughter, they still paid a dowry to the convent, though typically smaller than a marriage dowry would have been. For convents, accepting these reluctant members meant guaranteed income. Some convents became known as dumping grounds for aristocratic families' unwanted daughters, maintaining a steady flow of wealth by accepting women who would never have chosen religious life. The nuns administering these institutions became complicit in what amounted to kidnapping and false imprisonment. The reasons families resorted to forced enclosure varied, but often came down to money and control. In families with multiple daughters, marrying all of them off required enormous dowries. Placing one or more in convents was economically efficient. Convent dowries were smaller, and the daughters were removed from competition for family resources. Second and third daughters often found themselves designated for religious life from childhood, their futures decided before they could object. A heartbreaking Italian chronicle describes 5 sisters, the 3 youngest of whom were placed in a convent by age 14, so that the family's resources could focus on marrying the 2 eldest to advantageous matches. Some women were imprisoned in convents because they'd become inconvenient for other reasons. Widows whose husbands' families wanted control of their property might find themselves pressured or forced into convents, removing them from secular life and making their assets easier to claim. Women who had witnessed crimes or knew damaging secrets about powerful people could be silenced through enclosure. A few cases involve women placed in convents as punishment for sexual indiscretions or simply for being too independent-minded for their family's comfort. The transition from freedom to imprisonment was traumatic. Young women who had grown up in aristocratic households, accustomed to fine clothes, social activities, and the prospect of marriage and children, suddenly found themselves in institutions where every aspect of life was controlled. They had to wear uncomfortable habits, wake for prayers in the middle of the night, eat simple food, and spend their days in repetitive labour and worship. Many reacted with depression, anger, or desperate attempts to escape their situations. Rebellion within convent walls took many forms. Some unwilling nuns simply refused to cooperate with religious life. They wouldn't participate in prayers, wouldn't do assigned work. wouldn't follow rules about silence or modest behaviour. They made themselves difficult and disruptive, perhaps hoping their families would relent and remove them. A German abbess's letter from 1439 describes a young nun who had been in the convent for 3 years but refuses all instruction, speaks constantly against our holy life, corrupts younger sisters with complaints, and seems determined to make herself and everyone around her miserable. Others engaged in more dramatic acts of defiance. Do you remember those convent escapes we discussed earlier? Many involved women who'd been forced into religious life and were fleeing imprisonment rather than breaking genuine vows. Some attempted multiple escapes, caught and returned each time, their determination to be free overriding their fear of punishment. A French investigation from 1458 describes a nun who had escaped 4 times over 6 years, each time making it farther from the convent before being caught and brought back. Violence occasionally erupted when women were forced into convents against their will. A Spanish chronicle describes a scene in 1492 where a young woman, being delivered to a convent, fought so fiercely that it took 4 servants to restrain her. She screamed that she was being murdered, begged passers-by to help her, and tried to throw herself from the carriage. Once inside the convent, she barricaded herself in a cell and refused food for 3 days. Eventually she was subdued through a combination of physical force and threats, but the chronicle notes she never reconciled herself to her fate and died bitter and young. Some rebellions involved entire groups of unwilling nuns banding together against their forced vocations. When convents contained significant numbers of women who hadn't chosen to be there, these prisoners sometimes recognized their common cause and organized resistance. They would collectively refuse to attend certain services, make unified demands for better treatment, or simply create an atmosphere of defiance that made the convent difficult to govern. Abbesses faced the challenge of maintaining order over communities where many members were essentially hostages who viewed religious authorities as jailers rather than spiritual leaders. A few unwilling nuns found allies outside their convents who were willing to help them. Sympathetic family members, brothers who disagreed with their father's decisions, mothers who had been overruled by husbands sometimes worked to secure their release. In rare cases, lovers or would-be husbands staged dramatic rescues. The Italian incident from 1471 involved a young nobleman who, hearing that the woman he loved had been forced into the convent by her father, gathered friends and essentially raided the convent, carrying her away by force. This created a massive scandal and legal complications, but the couple eventually married and the woman never returned to religious life. Legal challenges to forced enclosure were possible but extremely difficult. A woman who could prove she'd been coerced into taking vows might petition church authorities for release, but the system was stacked against her. She needed to prove coercion years after the fact, often without witnesses willing to testify against powerful families. She needed access to legal counsel and the ability to navigate complex church bureaucracy. And she needed church officials to care more about her freedom than about maintaining the social order that gave families absolute authority over their daughters. A few successful legal challenges exist in the records. A German woman who'd been placed in a convent at age 13 petitioned for release at age 22, arguing she'd never genuinely consented to her vows. Her case dragged through church courts for 3 years before she was finally released, by which point she was 25, past the usual marriage age, and stigmatized by her years in the convent. Her victory was real but bitter. Her young adult years stolen by a system that should have protected rather than imprisoned her. The psychological damage inflicted on women forced into convents was profound and lasting. Many became deeply depressed, some to the point of suicide attempts. Others developed intense hatred of religion and religious life, their forced devotion poisoning genuine faith they might have otherwise developed. A few managed to adapt, finding aspects of convent life they could tolerate or even appreciate, but carrying always the knowledge that their choices had been stolen from them. An Italian nun who'd been forced into the convent at 14 wrote in old age that even after 40 years, she still felt like a prisoner and spent every day mourning the life she should have had. The system slowly began to change in the later medieval period and early Renaissance. Church reformers started insisting that genuine consent was necessary for valid religious vows. Some regions passed laws requiring that women choosing religious life be interviewed separately from their families to ensure their decisions were free. But these reforms came too late for thousands of medieval women who had already been imprisoned in the name of religion and family duty. Historians still argue about how widespread forced enclosure was. Some suggest it was relatively rare, affecting mainly aristocratic families with specific problems to solve. Others believe it was common enough to be a significant factor in convent demographics, with substantial percentages of nuns being there involuntarily. The truth probably varied by region, period, and social class, but the practice existed throughout the medieval period and damaged countless lives. You watch now as the young woman from the carriage is led through the convent gates, her father speaking briefly with the abbess before departing without looking back at his daughter. The gates close with a heavy finality. The girl stands in the courtyard, still in her secular clothes, looking around at the stone walls that will confine her for the rest of her life. Tomorrow she'll begin the process of becoming a nun, putting on the habit, learning the prayers, submitting to the discipline. But tonight she's still herself, still free in her mind if nowhere else. And in that mind, rebellion is already forming. You're hiding in the shadows of a convent corridor late at night, watching as 3 men in clerical robes enter through a side door that should be locked. They carry leather bags and their faces show grim determination. These aren't friendly visitors, they're investigators sent by the bishop, and they've arrived unannounced specifically to catch the convent off guard. Within the hour, they'll begin interrogations that will last for days. Nuns will be questioned separately, their answers compared for inconsistencies. Some will be subjected to physical examination so invasive and humiliating that the very thought makes you uncomfortable. Accusations of sexual misconduct have reached the bishop's ears, and he's determined to root out the truth through whatever methods necessary. By the time these investigators leave, several nuns will be broken, secrets will be exposed, and lives will be destroyed, all in the name of protecting virtue and enforcing vows. The investigation of sexual misconduct in medieval convents represents some of the darkest chapters in the history of church authority over women's bodies and lives. When accusations of broken chastity vows arose, whether involving relationships with men, relationships with other women, or pregnancies, church officials launched inquiries that combined genuine concern for religious discipline with voyeuristic obsession and brutal enforcement methods. The investigation process itself often became a form of punishment and abuse, subjecting women to interrogations, physical examinations, and psychological pressure that violated their dignity even when they were ultimately found innocent. The triggers for investigations varied. Sometimes they began with credible evidence, a pregnancy that couldn't be hidden, witnesses who saw misconduct, letters discovered that proved illicit relationships. Other times they started from rumour, jealous accusations, or the testimony of disgruntled nuns seeking revenge on enemies. Once an investigation began, it took on a life of its own, with investigators determined to justify the disruption they were causing by finding wrongdoing whether it existed or not. The presumption was often guilt until proven innocent. placing enormous burdens of proof on accused women. The interrogation methods were psychologically brutal. Accused nuns would be questioned for hours, often by multiple male clergy working in shifts to exhaust them. Investigators asked explicit questions about sexual acts in graphic detail, forcing women to discuss intimate matters with men who were strangers. The stated purpose was to determine exactly what sins had been committed, but the process itself was degrading and traumatic. Some nuns were questioned while standing, denied food or rest until they confessed. Others faced threats of excommunication, imprisonment, or eternal damnation if they didn't reveal the truth. The interrogators often used psychological manipulation to extract confessions. They might claim they already knew everything and that denial would only worsen punishment, pressuring innocent women to confess to acts they hadn't committed. They would tell accused nuns that others had already confessed and implicated them, creating doubt and fear even when this was a lie. They promised leniency for cooperation, then reneged once confessions were obtained. These tactics were sophisticated and effective, producing confessions that may or may not have reflected actual guilt. Physical examinations represented the most invasive aspect of many investigations. When nuns were accused of sexual relationships or when pregnancies were suspected, church authorities ordered medical examinations to determine whether the women were virgins. These examinations was based on medieval misconceptions about female anatomy, the belief that virginity could be definitively determined through physical inspection. Midwives or physicians, always working under male clerical supervision, would examine accused nuns' bodies, looking for signs of sexual activity that had no actual medical validity. The trauma of these examinations cannot be overstated. Medieval nuns had been taught that their bodies were temples of the Holy Spirit, that modesty was essential to virtue, that no one should see or touch their intimate areas. Being forcibly examined by strangers, often with male clergy present or nearby, was a devastating violation. Some women who underwent these examinations and were found innocent were nonetheless psychologically destroyed by the experience. A French investigation record from 1447 notes that a nun who was examined and cleared of accusations became melancholy and withdrawn afterward and died within 6 months. Though no physical cause of death could be determined, the medical evidence from these examinations was unreliable at best and completely fabricated at worst. Examiners might declare a woman had been sexually active based on signs that proved nothing. Athletic activity, horseback riding, medical conditions, and simple anatomical variation would all be misinterpreted as evidence of lost virginity. Some investigations clearly show examiners finding what investigators wanted them to find when authorities were determined to prove guilt. Examinations miraculously discovered evidence. But when powerful families wanted their daughters cleared, examinations found innocence. Group investigations were particularly brutal. When accusations suggested widespread misconduct within a convent, multiple pregnancies, systemic rule-breaking, or endemic immorality, investigators would examine and interrogate dozens of nuns. These mass investigations created atmospheres of terror within convents. Nuns didn't know who'd been accused, who was being questioned, or what others might be saying under pressure. The uncertainty bred paranoia, with nuns suspecting each other of being informants and relationships fracturing under the strain. A Spanish investigation in 1489 provides a particularly detailed record of these mass interrogations. Over 3 weeks, investigators questioned 42 nuns individually, asking each woman about her own behaviour and about what she had observed others doing. They created a chart tracking who accused whom of what offences, looking for patterns and corroboration. They examined the convent's physical layout to determine where illicit activities might have occurred. They interviewed servants and local townspeople about visitors to the convent and rumours they had heard. The investigation concluded that at least 8 nuns had engaged in sexual relationships. Though modern historians note that much of the evidence came from coerced testimony and unreliable accusations, the role of confession in these investigations was complex and problematic. In normal circumstances, anything said during the sacrament of confession was absolutely secret. Priests were forbidden from revealing what penitents told them. But in investigations, church authorities sometimes pressured confessors to break that seal, revealing information that nuns had shared in supposedly sacred confidence. Some confessors resisted this pressure, placing their duty to the sacrament above their duty to investigators. Others complied, betraying the trust of women who had sought spiritual counsel. Torture, while not officially sanctioned in investigations of nuns, occasionally occurred in practice. Some accused women were imprisoned in harsh conditions, cold cells, minimal food, isolation until they confessed or cooperated. A few investigations involve physical punishments presented as penances, but functioning as torture extended kneeling on stone floors, public whippings, or painful restraints. An Italian investigation in 1456 included testimony that an accused nun had been kept chained in a cell for 2 weeks while refusing to confess to allegations she claimed were false. She eventually confessed, then immediately recanted once released, saying she had admitted to lies just to end her suffering. The aftermath of investigations often damaged entire communities permanently. Even when most nuns were cleared of wrongdoing, the investigation process itself traumatized everyone involved. Trust between nuns evaporated when investigations revealed who had accused whom. Relationships between the convent and church authorities became hostile when nuns felt they had been treated unjustly. Some convents never recovered their reputations after investigations. Regardless of the outcomes, the mere fact of an inquiry suggested there had been something to investigate. The convicted faced punishments we've discussed before: public penance, imprisonment, expulsion, or transfer to penitential institutions, but investigations also punished the innocent through the trauma of the process itself. Women who were cleared of all charges nonetheless carried the memory of interrogations, examinations, and accusations. Some left religious life voluntarily after investigations, unable to continue living in places where they had endured such violations. Others remained, but were forever changed, their trust in religious authority destroyed by what had been done to them in its name. Some historians view these investigations as necessary enforcement of religious discipline in an era when sexual morality was taken extremely seriously. Others see them as instruments of patriarchal control, using invasive procedures and psychological torture to terrorize and dominate women. The truth likely includes elements of both genuine concern for maintaining standards, mixed with deeply misogynistic assumptions about women's sexuality, and a willingness to use any methods necessary to control female bodies and behaviour. What's undeniable is that the investigation system created enormous potential for abuse. The power dynamics were completely one-sided: male clergy investigating women who had no advocates, no legal protections, and no ability to refuse cooperation. The methods relied on coercion, invasion of privacy, and psychological manipulation, and the outcomes depended as much on social class, family connections, and investigator biases as on actual guilt or innocence. You watch now as the first nun is called for questioning, a young woman barely 20 years old, her face white with fear. She disappears into the room where the investigators wait, and the door closes behind her. For the next several hours, You hear nothing but occasional sounds, raised voices, weeping, periods of silence. When she finally emerges, she looks shattered, barely able to walk. Another nun is immediately called in to take her place. The process will continue for days, grinding through the entire community, leaving trauma in its wake regardless of what truth, if any, is finally revealed. You stand in the cellars beneath a German convent, surrounded by enormous wooden barrels that stretch into the shadows. The air is thick with the yeasty smell of fermenting beer, and you hear the steady drip of liquid being transferred from one container to another. A nun in a stained work apron tests a sample, nodding with satisfaction before making notes on a wax tablet. This isn't a side project or a small operation for the convent's own consumption. This is a full-scale commercial brewery producing hundreds of barrels annually, competing successfully with secular breweries in the region and generating substantial income. The nun supervising the operation isn't just a beer maker. She's a businesswoman running a profitable enterprise that helps fund the entire convent. Welcome to the unexpected world of medieval nuns as entrepreneurs and business leaders. While popular imagination pictures medieval nuns spending their days in prayer and contemplation, the reality for many convents involved running complex business operations that would impress modern entrepreneurs. Brewing was just one of many commercial activities that convents engaged in. They operated hospitals and provided medical care for fees. They ran schools educating the daughters of noble families. They manufactured textiles, raised livestock, managed farms, and engaged in trade. Some convents became significant economic players in their regions, employing numerous lay workers, controlling substantial properties, and generating income streams that supported not just the religious community, but also charitable works and economic development. Beer brewing was particularly important in Northern European convents, because beer was safer to drink than water in medieval cities, making it a staple beverage for all social classes. Convents had several advantages in the brewing business. They had access to clean water from wells, knowledge of herbs and ingredients through their medical work, large cellars for storage, and reputations for quality and honesty that secular brewers lacked. People trusted that nuns wouldn't water down their beer or use inferior ingredients, giving convent breweries a competitive edge. Some convent breweries became famous for their products. A Flemish convent in the 14th century produced a beer that was sought after by nobility across the region, commanding premium prices and generating enough income to fund major building projects. The nuns guarded their recipe jealously, passing brewing knowledge from one generation to the next through hands-on training rather than written records. When a rival brewery attempted to copy their product, the nuns successfully argued before local authorities that their recipe was a form of property that deserved legal protection, an early example of intellectual property rights. Hospitals run by convents represented another major business enterprise. Though one with a more explicitly charitable mission, many medieval hospitals were essentially hospices for the elderly poor, lepers, or travellers who fell ill on pilgrimages. Convents operated these facilities, with nuns providing nursing care, preparing meals, administering medicines, and managing the business aspects. Wealthier patients paid fees for better accommodations and care, subsidising the free treatment provided to the poor. A French convent hospital from the 15th century had a sophisticated tiered pricing system. Private rooms cost significantly more than beds in common wards, special diets cost extra, and extended stays had volume discounts. The medical knowledge that convent nurses possessed was considerable, built up through practical experience and study of medical texts. They understood wound care, could set broken bones, knew which herbs treated which conditions, and could diagnose common illnesses. Some convent hospitals kept detailed records of treatments and outcomes, essentially conducting early medical research. An Italian convent's medical records from the 1440s show sophisticated tracking of plague symptoms and survival rates under different treatment protocols, suggesting genuine scientific observation rather than just traditional healing practices. Textile production represented a major convent industry across Europe. Nuns produced embroidered altar cloths, fine linens, tapestries, and ecclesiastical vestments that were sold to wealthy patrons, other religious houses, and secular customers. The highest quality embroidery work, called opus anglicanum, when produced in England, required years of training and commanded extraordinary prices. A single embroidered vestment might take a nun months to complete and sell, for amounts that would support the convent for a year. These weren't hobby crafts, they were luxury goods produced by highly skilled artisans. The business aspects of these textile operations were complex. Convents negotiated contracts with customers, purchased raw materials from suppliers, maintained quality control, handled shipping and delivery, and managed payment collection. A Spanish convent's account books from 1472 reveal a sophisticated operation tracking multiple concurrent projects, partial payments, material costs, and profit margins. The abbess essentially functioned as a CEO, making strategic decisions about which projects to accept, how to price their work competitively, and how to invest profits back into the business. Some convents operated schools that educated daughters of noble and wealthy merchant families, charging substantial fees for boarding, instruction, and the social prestige of a convent education. These weren't just religious instruction students learn reading, writing, arithmetic, music, languages, and sometimes even subjects like astronomy or philosophy. A few convents became famous for their educational programs, attracting students from across Europe. Historians still argue whether these were primarily businesses seeking income or charitable educational missions that happened to generate revenue. But the practical effect was the same: they were profitable enterprises. Agricultural operations provided steady income for convents that controlled farmland. Unlike individual peasant farmers working small plots, convents could implement systematic management across extensive properties. They practiced crop rotation, maintained breeding programs for livestock, invested in improved tools and techniques, and planned for long-term productivity rather than just surviving year to year. Some convent farms became models of medieval agricultural efficiency, producing surplus crops that could be sold at market while still feeding the convent community and storing reserves against bad harvests. Wine production, particularly in France and Italy, represented another major convent business. Convents owned vineyards, produced wine for both sacramental use and commercial sale, and sometimes operated taverns or sold directly to merchants. The wine business required significant capital investment. Vineyards took years to become productive, required constant maintenance, and produced income only seasonally. But successful convent vineyards generated substantial profits over time. A Burgundian convent in the late 15th century was producing over 10,000 litres of wine annually, most of which was sold commercially rather than consumed by the nuns themselves. The business acumen required to run these enterprises was considerable. Abbesses and their administrators needed to understand accounting, contract law, market conditions, labour management, and long-term strategic planning. They negotiated with suppliers and customers, handled disputes, made investment decisions, and managed employees. Some abbesses proved to be brilliant businesswomen who expanded their convent's wealth dramatically. Others struggled, making poor decisions that left their communities in financial difficulty. One particularly impressive example is a German abbess in the 1430s who inherited a convent drowning in debt with aging buildings and declining membership. Over 20 years, she restructured the convent's finances, expanded its brewing operation, secured new property through strategic donations, and established a reputation for financial stability that attracted new members from wealthy families bringing generous dowries. By the time she died, the convent owned twice as much property, had completely eliminated its debt, and had cash reserves sufficient to sustain operations for several years without any income. Labour management presented ethical and practical challenges. Convents employed lay servants and workers brewers, farmers, cooks, builders, and more. These employees needed fair wages, reasonable working conditions, and respectful treatment. But they also needed to be productive enough to justify their costs. Some convents developed reputations as good employers, attracting skilled workers and benefiting from their loyalty and expertise. Others were criticised for exploiting workers, paying minimal wages while demanding maximum output. A Flemish chronicle describes a convent brewery where working conditions were so poor that employees repeatedly quit, forcing the nuns to constantly train new workers and suffering from inconsistent product quality. The relationship between convents' business activities and their religious missions was sometimes tense. Critics argued that nuns engaged in commerce were too focused on worldly concerns, that making money distracted from prayer and spiritual development. Some reform movements tried to restrict convent business activities, arguing that nuns should be supported through donations and endowments, rather than through their own commercial enterprises. Defenders countered that these businesses allowed convents to be self-sufficient, to support charitable works, and to give nuns meaningful work beyond repetitive prayer. The economic impact of convent businesses on their local communities was significant. They provided employment, purchased supplies from local producers, paid taxes, and contributed to regional economic networks. When a major convent closed or declined, the economic effects rippled through the surrounding area. An English convent that had been a major employer and purchaser in its region closed during the Reformation. Local records show that the closure contributed to economic depression in nearby towns as jobs disappeared and a major customer for local goods vanished. Some convent businesses faced competition and hostility from secular enterprises that resented their advantages. Male brewers' guilds sometimes tried to restrict convent brewing through legal challenges, arguing that nuns shouldn't compete in commercial markets. Textile producers complained that convent workshops had unfair advantages through donated materials and volunteer labour from novices. These conflicts occasionally turned ugly, with accusations that convents were exploiting their religious status for commercial gain. A few cases resulted in restrictions being placed on what convents could produce or sell. The women who managed these businesses demonstrated skills and capabilities that medieval society generally denied that women possessed. Through running breweries, hospitals, farms, and schools, nuns proved themselves capable of everything men claimed women couldn't do: complex accounting, strategic planning, negotiation, leadership, and technical expertise. Some historians see convent business activities as early examples of women's entrepreneurship and economic empowerment, spaces where women could exercise abilities that would otherwise have been completely suppressed. You watch now as the nun in the brewery approves a shipment of barrels to be loaded onto carts and delivered to customers in town. She haggles briefly with the carter over delivery fees, settles on a price, and makes a note in her accounts. Tomorrow she'll test a new recipe she's been developing, aiming to create a beer that will command even higher prices. She's not thinking about prayer or contemplation right now. She's thinking about market competition, profit margins, and business growth. And in that moment, she's as much a businesswoman as any merchant in the medieval economy. You slip into the convent's great hall on a December evening, expecting to find nuns at quiet prayer or simple recreation. Instead, you discover a scene that looks more like a noble banquet than a religious house. Long tables groan under platters of roasted meats, pastries, fruits preserved in honey, and wine flowing freely. Musicians play lively dance tunes in the corner, not hymns, but popular songs you've heard in taverns. Several nuns have removed their wimples, their hair decorated with ribbons. Others are dancing together, laughing, their habits hitched up to allow free movement. In the centre of it all, the abbess raises her wine cup in a toast, and the room erupts in cheers. This isn't a solemn religious observance, this is a party, and these nuns are determined to enjoy themselves. Medieval convents weren't always the austere, silent spaces that religious rules demanded. Behind closed doors, many religious communities celebrated with feasts, theatrical performances, dancing, games, and festivities that would have scandalised external observers and did scandalise church authorities when they discovered them. These celebrations represented moments of joy and humanity in otherwise restricted lives, but they also represented flagrant violations of rules designed to keep nuns separate from worldly pleasures. The history of forbidden convent celebrations reveals communities finding creative ways to inject fun, festivity, and fellowship into lives that were supposed to be all sacrifice and solemnity. Feast days provided the official excuse for many celebrations. But what happened often went far beyond what church authorities intended. Christmas, Easter, saints' feast days, and the anniversary of a convent's founding were meant to be marked with special prayers and perhaps slightly better meals. In practice, wealthy convents used these occasions to stage elaborate celebrations complete with multiple course banquets, expensive wines, entertainment, and general merriment. A French bishop's complaint from 1398 describes visiting a convent on St. Agnes's Day and finding the nuns holding what he called a festival more suited to a duke's palace than a house of God, with acrobats performing, excessive quantities of food and drink, and laughter and frivolity entirely inappropriate to the religious state. The food served at these secret feasts would make modern holiday dinners look modest. Account books from wealthy convents show purchases before major feast days of items like peacock, swan, expensive spices from the Far East, white bread made from finely milled flour, imported wines, and elaborate sugar confections. These weren't simple communal meals, they were displays of wealth and status, assertions that noble nuns deserved to eat like nobles regardless of their religious vows. One German convent's records show that for Christmas in 1456 they purchased enough wine to give each nun more than a gallon, plus multiple courses of meat despite rules requiring simpler fare. Music and dancing were explicitly forbidden in most monastic rules, classified as worldly entertainments that distracted from spiritual focus. Yet multiple investigations discovered that convents regularly hosted musical performances and dance. Some convents had resident musicians lay servants who could play instruments, while others invited performers from outside. The music ranged from relatively innocent folk songs to bawdy popular ballads that church authorities considered completely inappropriate. Dancing happened both among the nuns themselves and occasionally with male visitors present, which added scandalous impropriety to the basic rule violation. Theatrical performances represented another forbidden entertainment that some convents embraced enthusiastically. Medieval religious drama plays depicting biblical stories or saints' lives was acceptable in principle. But some convent performances went well beyond pious educational theatre. A Spanish investigation in 1482 described a Christmas play at a convent that included elaborate costumes, comic interludes with secular jokes, and a banquet scene where the actors actually consumed wine on stage. The bishop who witnessed it was appalled, particularly by a sequence where nuns playing shepherds engaged in slapstick comedy that he felt was beneath the dignity of brides of Christ. Some convents celebrated Carnival the festival before Lent with enthusiasm that rivaled secular celebrations. Carnival traditionally allowed for excess and rule-breaking before the austere Lenten period. But it was supposed to be a secular festival, not something religious communities participated in. Nonetheless, evidence shows some convents hosting carnival celebrations complete with costumes, masks, role reversals, and general chaos. An Italian chronicle describes a convent where during carnival, younger nuns elected a mock abbess who issued silly commands that everyone had to obey, creating temporary hierarchy inversions and permission for behaviour that would normally be punished. Games of chance dice, cards, and other gambling were condemned by church authorities as promoting vice and wasting time. Yet investigations repeatedly discovered nuns playing games, sometimes gambling with small stakes. An English visitation in 1432 found evidence that nuns had been playing cards regularly, had created their own deck decorated with religious imagery to make it seem less worldly, and had established an elaborate scoring system. When confronted, they argued the games were innocent recreation that harmed no one, but the bishop disagreed and confiscated their cards. Alcohol consumption during these celebrations often exceeded appropriate limits. While wine was a normal part of medieval diet and convents regularly served it at meals, the quantities consumed during secret celebrations suggest serious overindulgence. Multiple investigation reports describe nuns found drunk during feast day celebrations, unable to attend services properly, behaving in undignified ways. A German investigation from 1445 includes testimony from a lay servant who described several nuns becoming so intoxicated during a celebration that they had to be carried to their cells, and one who became ill from drinking too much sweet wine. The motivation behind these celebrations was partly simple human desire for fun and pleasure. Life in medieval convents could be monotonous, restrictive, and emotionally isolating. Celebrations provided breaks from routine, opportunities for laughter and connection, moments of joy in otherwise constrained existences. For women who hadn't chosen religious life or who struggled with their vocations, these festivities might have been essential coping mechanisms that made their situations bearable. But these celebrations also represented assertions of identity and status. Noble nuns who hosted elaborate feasts were claiming their right to live according to their social class despite their religious vows. They were rejecting the idea that becoming a nun meant accepting a lower standard of living or abandoning the pleasures they'd grown up with. In their minds, being daughters of aristocracy didn't end at the convent gate, and celebrations were ways of maintaining their noble identities within religious settings. The practical organisation of secret celebrations required planning and conspiracy. Someone had to arrange for extra food and wine to be purchased or smuggled in. Musicians or performers had to be invited without arousing suspicion from authorities outside the convent. Lookouts had to watch for unexpected visitors who might discover the festivities. The entire community, or at least significant portions of it, had to agree to keep secrets, to not report violations to superiors or external authorities. This required trust and solidarity that couldn't exist in communities torn by conflict. Not all nuns participated willingly in these celebrations. Some found them genuinely offensive to their religious sensibilities. Others feared the consequences if they were discovered. A few investigation reports include testimony from nuns who described feeling pressured to participate in festivities they considered inappropriate. Caught between their consciences and social pressure from their sisters, One French nun testified in 1467 that she'd repeatedly asked to be excused from feast day celebrations that involved dancing and excessive drinking. But the abbess had insisted her presence was required, and refusing would have created conflict. The consequences when celebrations are discovered varied depending on who discovered them and how egregious the violations were. Sometimes abbesses received stern warnings and orders to reform without facing serious punishment. Other times, particularly when celebrations involved outsiders or especially scandalous behaviour, entire convent leadership teams could be removed. A Spanish convent where investigators discovered evidence of regular feast day celebrations featuring male guests. Drinking and dancing saw its abbess defrocked and 3 senior nuns transferred to stricter houses. Reform movements within the church repeatedly targeted these celebrations as symbols of convent corruption. Reformers argued that nuns engaging in feasting, entertainment, and frivolity had abandoned their spiritual purposes and needed to return to authentic religious life. Some reform efforts successfully imposed stricter discipline, ending celebrations in convents that had hosted them for decades. Other convents resisted reform, maintaining their festive traditions despite external pressure. The persistence of celebrations despite prohibitions and risks reveals how important they were to convent communities. These weren't just occasional lapses in discipline, they were established traditions, anticipated events that gave structure and meaning to the year. Nuns looked forward to feast day celebrations, planned for them, derived joy from them. For many, these moments of celebration made the rest of religious life tolerable, providing emotional sustenance that prayer alone couldn't deliver. Modern historians debate how to interpret these forbidden celebrations. Some view them as evidence that many medieval nuns weren't truly committed to religious life and shouldn't have been in convents at all. Others see them as humanizing moments that don't diminish the nuns' genuine spirituality, but rather show them as complete human beings with needs for joy, community, and pleasure alongside their religious devotions. Perhaps the truth is that medieval nuns, like all people, contained multitudes capable of both genuine piety and genuine pleasure. Both spiritual dedication and human needs for celebration. You watch now as the party continues into the evening, the music growing louder, the laughter more uninhibited. The abbess has joined a group of younger nuns in a circle dance, her usual stern demeanour replaced by genuine happiness. Tomorrow morning they'll all be back in the chapel for morning prayers, properly veiled and solemn. The night's festivities are secrets shared among sisters. But tonight they're simply women enjoying themselves, finding moments of joy in lives that offer too few of them, and refusing to let religious rules completely suppress their humanity and their happiness. You're standing in the courtyard of a Spanish convent in 1480, watching as a group of male church officials arrives with armed guards. The air crackles with tension. The abbess stands at the entrance to the main building, arms crossed, flanked by a dozen nuns who look equally defiant. The officials carry scrolls, new regulations designed to impose stricter enclosure, eliminate private property, restrict visitors, and generally transform this relatively relaxed religious community into something far more austere. The lead official begins reading the reforms aloud, his voice echoing off stone walls. Before he finishes, the abbess interrupts. "We do not accept these rules," she declares. "This is our house, governed by our traditions. You have no authority here." What follows will be remembered as one of the most dramatic confrontations between female religious independence and male church authority, a resistance that will turn violent before it ends. Throughout the late medieval period, reform movements within the Catholic Church targeted convents that had drifted from strict observance of monastic rules. Male church authorities, often responding to genuine corruption but also driven by desires to control autonomous female communities, attempted to impose stricter regulations on convents that had been governing themselves with considerable independence. These reform efforts met fierce resistance from nuns who viewed them as unjust intrusions, violations of their traditional rights, and attempts by men to dominate communities that women had been managing successfully for generations. The resulting conflict sometimes escalated into physical confrontations, legal battles, and acts of defiance that reveal how strongly some medieval nuns valued their autonomy. The reforms typically targeted the same issues, repeatedly eliminating private property and requiring true communal living, enforcing strict enclosure to prevent nuns from leaving convents or having contact with outsiders, restricting visitors and ending the relatively open parlour culture, imposing uniform clothing standards and eliminating fashionable modifications to habits, requiring attendance at all religious services without exceptions, and generally transforming relatively comfortable religious communities into much harsher environments. For nuns who had lived under more relaxed rules for years or decades, these changes represented unacceptable losses of freedom and dignity. One of the most famous resistance movements occurred at the convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas, Spain, in the 1460s, when a reforming bishop attempted to impose strict observant Franciscan rules on this community that had been following more relaxed conventual rules. The nuns simply refused. They barred the doors against the reform-minded friars sent to instruct them. When the bishop threatened excommunication, they appealed to higher church authorities, arguing that their convent had papal privileges protecting their traditional way of life. The legal battle lasted 8 years, with the nuns ultimately winning the right to continue their less restrictive observance. Physical resistance occasionally erupted when authorities tried to force reforms. A German convent in 1452 responded to reformers by literally throwing objects at them from upper windows when they tried to enter. The nuns rang bells continuously to drown out the reformers' speeches, refused to attend meetings, and organised shifts to guard entrances and prevent reformers from accessing certain areas. When the bishop threatened to send armed men to enforce compliance, the abbess wrote to local nobles who had family members in the convent, and within days secular authorities made it clear they wouldn't support using force against noble women, even rebellious ones in convents. Some resistance took the form of massive organised departures. When a Flemish convent had strict reforms imposed in 1417 nuns, more than half the community requested transfers to other houses that followed less austere rules. This exodus threatened the convent's viability, as the departing nuns were among the wealthiest, and their dowries had been funding operations. The abbess who had supported reform found herself governing an impoverished remnant, while the departed nuns successfully re-established themselves elsewhere and continued their previous lifestyle. The reform technically succeeded but left behind a hollow victory. Legal strategies were common resistance tools. Nuns appealed reform decisions to higher church authorities, to papal courts, and sometimes to secular courts, arguing that reforms violated their traditional privileges, their founding charters, or legal agreements their families had made when they entered religious life. These legal battles could drag on for years, during which the contested reforms were often held in abeyance. An Italian convent fought reform efforts through courts for 12 years, employing lawyers and canon law experts, generating mountains of legal documents, and ultimately winning significant concessions that allowed them to maintain much of their traditional independence. Financial resistance proved particularly effective. When reforms were imposed, as some wealthy nuns threatened to withdraw their financial support or take their resources with them if they transferred to other convents. Since many convents were heavily dependent on the incomes from properties associated with wealthy members' dowries, these threats had real weight. A French convent facing reform had 3 nuns whose combined dowries funded nearly half the community's expenses. When these women threatened to leave and, through legal manoeuvres, take their endowments with them, the reform effort collapsed. The rhetoric that resisting nuns used reveals how they understood their situation. They appealed to tradition, arguing they were following the rules as they had received them, and that imposing new standards was unjust innovation. They emphasized their noble status, asserting that daughters of aristocracy deserved treatment appropriate to their rank even in religious settings. They claimed rights based on legal charters and papal privileges that protected their autonomy. Some argued that male reformers were motivated by desire to control women rather than genuine religious concern, an accusation that was sometimes accurate. Public opinion sometimes supported resisting nuns against reforming authorities. In communities where convents were important economic and social institutions, local people often sided with the nuns against outside reformers. When a bishop attempted to impose reforms on a German convent in 1475, townspeople rioted, preventing his officials from entering the convent and forcing them to retreat. The town council then formally requested that the bishop leave the convent alone, arguing that it had served the community well for generations and that disrupting it would cause more harm than good. Some resistance succeeded in blocking or significantly moderating reforms. Nuns who fought back effectively, who had powerful family connections, and who could sustain resistance over time often won concessions. The resulting compromises might involve implementing some reforms but not others, or applying rules more flexibly than reformers initially intended. A Spanish convent agreed to accept stricter enclosure rules, but negotiated exemptions for elderly nuns, preservation of private property for wealthy members, and continuation of their traditional feast day celebrations. Other resistance efforts failed, ending in forced compliance and punishment for leaders. When a Flemish convent's defiance became too blatant, church authorities removed the abbess and several senior nuns, replacing them with nuns from reformed houses who had enforced the new rules. The displaced leaders were sent to strict penitential convents, making examples of them to discourage further resistance. The remaining nuns, demoralized and leaderless, accepted reforms they had previously fought. The underlying tension in these conflicts was fundamentally about power and autonomy. Male church authorities believed they had the right and duty to govern female religious communities, to set standards, and to enforce compliance. Many nuns believed their communities were self-governing, that centuries of tradition gave them rights and privileges that couldn't simply be overridden, and that they were perfectly capable of managing their own religious lives without male supervision. These incompatible views made conflict inevitable. Some historians view resisting nuns as corrupt women clinging to improper privileges and refusing legitimate spiritual discipline. Others see them as women defending hard-won autonomy against patriarchal intrusion, fighting to preserve communities they had built and spaces where they exercised real authority. Both perspectives contain truth. Some resisting nuns were indeed defending practices that violated their religious vows, but some were fighting against genuinely unjust impositions designed more to assert male control than to improve spiritual life. The reform conflicts reveal the complex social positions that medieval convents occupied. They were religious institutions subject to church authority, but they were also aristocratic communities with powerful family connections and social influence. They were supposed to be humble and obedient, but they controlled substantial wealth and property. They were meant to be separate from the world, but they were deeply embedded in their local communities. These contradictions created spaces where women could exercise authority and independence, and they fought to preserve those spaces when men tried to eliminate them. The outcomes of these conflicts varied across regions and time periods. In some areas, reform movements successfully imposed stricter observance on previously relaxed convents. In others, nuns' resistance preserved traditional autonomy. The pattern suggests that success depended on particular circumstances, the strength of the nuns' legal positions, their families' influence, local political dynamics, and the determination of both sides. There was no inevitable outcome. Each conflict was genuinely contested. You watch now as the confrontation in the courtyard escalates. The officials move forward to enter the convent by force. The nuns lock arms, forming a human barrier. The guards look uncomfortable, clearly reluctant to use violence against noble women in religious habits. The standoff continues for hours, neither side willing to back down. Eventually, messengers are sent to the bishop, to the local noble whose daughters are among the resistors, and to higher church authorities. This conflict won't be resolved today, or perhaps for years, but what's clear already is that these nuns will not submit without a fight, and that fight will test just how much autonomy medieval women can claim even within the restrictive structures of religious life. You find yourself in the chapter house of a French convent in 1485, sitting among 20 assembled nuns as investigators question them one by one. The air feels heavy with fear and suspicion. 3 nuns have already been taken away accused not of pregnancy or forbidden love affairs, but of something far more dangerous: witchcraft. The accusations began when crops failed on convent lands. Then an abbess died suddenly. Then a nun claimed to have seen shadowy figures gathering in the garden at midnight. Now the investigators are searching cells, examining personal possessions for evidence of magical practices, asking questions about herbs kept in the infirmary, demanding to know whether anyone has been seen writing strange symbols or muttering incantations. The line between mystical religious experience and demonic witchcraft was always thin, and now that line has collapsed entirely. You realise that in this room, being too spiritual might be as dangerous as being not spiritual enough. Witchcraft accusations represented perhaps the most terrifying danger that medieval nuns faced, because the line between approved mysticism and condemned witchcraft was impossibly vague and subject to sudden reinterpretation. The same visions that might be celebrated as divine revelation could be reframed as demonic deception. The same healing herbs that were praised when they cured might be evidence of maleficium, harmful magic when patients died. The same deep spiritual practices that marked a genuine mystic could look like trafficking with demons to hostile investigators. And once accused, nuns had few defences, as the witch-hunting apparatus presumed guilt and used methods designed to extract confessions regardless of actual innocence. The factors that made nuns vulnerable to witchcraft accusations were built into their way of life. They possessed knowledge of medicinal herbs, some of which were also associated with magic and poison. They experienced visions and mystical states that could be interpreted as either divine or demonic. They lived in all-female communities, which some authorities viewed with suspicion as potential sites of unnatural activities. They had access to religious objects and rituals that could theoretically be perverted to magical purposes. And they existed in a liminal space, not quite secular women, but not quite part of the male clerical hierarchy that made them vulnerable when society needed scapegoats for unexplained misfortunes. The specific accusations varied but followed predictable patterns. Nuns might be accused of causing illness through curses or potions, of creating storms or crop failures through weather magic, of engaging in night flights to demonic gatherings, of making pacts with Satan, or of performing blasphemous inversions of religious rituals. Some accusations emerged from genuine belief that supernatural evil was at work. Others came from personal grudges dressed up in supernatural language. And some were manufactured by investigators looking to demonstrate their zeal in fighting Satan's influence. One extensively documented case occurred in a German convent in 1470 where a nun named Sister Magdalena was accused of witchcraft after several members of the community fell mysteriously ill. The investigation revealed that Magdalena had been the infirmarian responsible for preparing medicines. When 2 nuns died despite her treatments, suspicions arose that she had been poisoning rather than healing. Under interrogation, other nuns testified that they had seen her collecting unusual herbs at night, that she muttered to herself while preparing medicines, and that she kept a black cat that might be a demonic familiar. Magdalena was tortured and eventually confessed to making a pact with the devil, attending witches' sabbaths and causing the deaths through maleficium. She was executed by burning. Modern historians examining the Magdalena case note several troubling elements. The unusual herbs she collected were likely just medicinal plants she needed for the infirmary. Her muttering was probably prayers or simply talking to herself while working a common habit. The black cat was one of several cats the convent kept to control mice. The deaths she was accused of causing were more likely due to diseases she couldn't cure with medieval medicine. And her confession came only after torture that would make anyone admit to anything. The case reveals how ordinary behaviour could be reinterpreted as sinister when viewed through the lens of witch-hunting paranoia. The peak period of witch trials in Europe, roughly 1450 to 1750, overlapped with the later medieval period and Renaissance, and nuns were not immune from the hysteria. Some witch trials involved only 1 or 2 accused nuns, but a few escalated into mass accusations that tore entire communities apart. An Italian convent in 1491 experienced a wave of accusations where ultimately 8 nuns were charged with witchcraft. The investigation began with 1 accusation. Then, through interrogation and torture, the accused implicated others, who under torture implicated still more. The pattern is characteristic of witch hunt dynamics, where initial accusations spread like infection through vulnerable communities. The torture methods used on accused nuns were the same brutal techniques applied to other suspected witches, the strappado, where victims were suspended by their arms, tied behind their backs, thumbscrews that crushed fingers, the rack that stretched bodies until joints dislocated, and sleep deprivation that could last days. These methods were designed to break resistance and extract confessions, not to determine truth. Under such torture, innocent women would confess to flying on broomsticks, copulating with demons, killing babies, and any other accusation their interrogators suggested. Historians still argue about what percentage of witchcraft confessions reflected any genuine practices versus being entirely the products of torture and suggestion. The theological framework that allowed nuns to be accused of witchcraft was complex and contradictory. In theory, nuns were protected by their vows, their participation in sacraments, and their dedication to God. Satan supposedly had no power over those truly devoted to Christ. But witch-hunting literature developed elaborate explanations for how even nuns could fall into demonic traps. Perhaps they had taken vows insincerely. Perhaps Satan specifically targeted religious women as particularly valuable conquests. Perhaps their visions had always been demonic deceptions disguised as divine revelations. These theological gymnastics allowed investigators to maintain that nuns could indeed be witches despite the apparent contradictions. The mystic practices that many nuns engaged in created particular vulnerabilities, fasting to the point of emaciation, engaging in ecstatic visions, claiming divine communications, experiencing stigmata. All of these could be reinterpreted as demonic rather than divine. A nun who was celebrated as a mystic one year might find those same experiences used as evidence against her in a witch trial the next year. The difference often came down to political circumstances, personal enemies, and whether authorities were in a mood to see mysticism as holy or diabolical. Some accusations specifically targeted nuns' medical knowledge. The boundary between healing and harmful magic was thin in medieval thought. Both involved mysterious knowledge of herbs and natural processes. Both could involve rituals and incantations, and both produced effects that weren't fully understood. When medicines cured, the nun was a skilled healer blessed by God. When patients died, she might be a witch using poisons. A Spanish investigation in 1488 focused on a nun whose herbal remedies had successfully treated numerous patients, but who came under suspicion when a prominent local woman died despite her treatment. The investigation interpreted her previous successes as evidence that she possessed supernatural power, which could be either divine or demonic, and chose to interpret it as demonic. The social dynamics within convents could turn accusations into weapons in personal conflicts. Historians still argue whether witchcraft accusations primarily reflected genuine belief in supernatural evil or were tools for settling scores and eliminating rivals. A nun might accuse another of witchcraft because she genuinely believed it, because she wanted to destroy an enemy, or because pressure from investigators made her provide names. The complex social environments of convents with their factions, feuds, and power struggles created conditions where witch accusations could serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Not all accused nuns were convicted. Some had powerful family connections who intervened. Others convinced investigators of their innocence through consistent testimony, evidence of genuine piety, or simply luck. A few cases were dismissed when investigators concluded the accusations were malicious or unfounded. But even acquittal didn't undo the damage. A nun who'd been accused of witchcraft carried that stigma permanently. Her community might never fully trust her again. Her spiritual authority was compromised, and she lived with the knowledge that accusation could return at any time. The death toll from witchcraft accusations against nuns is impossible to determine precisely. Record keeping was incomplete. Many trials left little documentation, and distinguishing which executed women were nuns versus secular women is sometimes difficult. But hundreds of cases are documented, and the actual number was likely higher. Each execution represented not just a life ended, but also a community traumatized, as nuns witnessed one of their sisters accused, tortured, and killed by the very church authorities who were supposed to protect them. Some reform-minded thinkers, even during the medieval period, questioned witch trials' methods and assumptions. A few argued that confessions extracted through torture were unreliable, that the evidence standards were too lax, and that innocent people were being killed. But these skeptical voices were minority positions until much later. During the peak witch-hunting period, the dominant view was that witchcraft was real, prevalent, and required aggressive prosecution. Nuns caught in this machinery had few defenders. The psychological impact on convent communities of witnessing or experiencing witch accusations must have been profound. The fear that speaking out against injustice might result in oneself being accused created silence and complicity. The knowledge that mystical experiences or medical knowledge could turn deadly made spiritual practice dangerous. The realization that torture could make anyone confess to anything undermined faith in justice. And the experience of seeing sisters women who had prayed beside them for years accused, broken, and killed created trauma that would reverberate through generations. You watch now as the investigators finish their interrogations and announce they're taking 3 more nuns into custody for further questioning. A euphemism everyone understands means torture. The accused women are led away, one weeping, one praying loudly, one silent and pale. The remaining nuns sit frozen, each wondering if she might be next, reviewing her own life for anything that could be twisted into evidence of witchcraft. Investigators promise to return tomorrow to search the convent more thoroughly. No one feels safe. The line between the holy and the heretical has disappeared, and in its absence, only fear remains. The decades pass, seasons change, the wheel turns. You find yourself back in that same convent years later, in the quiet hour before dawn. The chapel is empty now, except for a single elderly nun kneeling in prayer. She is perhaps the last one who remembers those dark days of investigation and accusation, who carries memories of sisters lost to fear and fire. Her hands, gnarled with age, clutch her rosary, and her lips move in silent prayer, not the formal liturgy of the hours, but something more personal. She prays for the souls of those who are taken, for forgiveness for those who are accused, for understanding of mysteries that remain unexplained. Outside the chapel windows, dawn begins to break, soft light filtering through coloured glass and painting gentle colours across stone floors. The world beyond these walls continues its turning. Villagers wake, markets open, life goes on. But here in this sacred space, time feels suspended, holding room for both remembrance and release. The nun's prayer becomes a whisper, then a breath, then silence. She rises slowly, her movements careful with age, and makes her way toward the door. Behind her, candles flicker and steady, their light dancing across walls that have witnessed centuries of secrets, scandals, sorrows, and small triumphs. The stories held within these walls of forbidden love and desperate escape, of poison and power, of rebellion and resistance are fading now into the realm of history. The women who lived them are long gone. Their voices silent except for the fragments preserved in investigation reports, account books, and chronicles written mostly by men who didn't understand them. But something of their spirit remains, their refusal to be completely contained. Their insistence on being fully human even when humanity was deemed sinful. Their complex navigation of impossible situations. As morning light fills the chapel completely, you realize that these medieval nuns were neither saints nor sinners, but something more interesting and more true. They were women, complete and complicated, living lives of genuine devotion mixed with genuine human weakness, negotiating between the ideals imposed upon them and the reality of their desires and needs. Their scandals were real, their struggles authentic, and their stories, however shocking or secret, deserve to be remembered not as cautionary tales, but as testament to the irreducible complexity of human lives lived in the shadow of absolute rules. The bells begin to ring for morning prayers, their sound echoing across the convent grounds and out into the awakening world. Other nuns emerge from their cells and make their way to chapel, their habits rustling softly in the stillness, their faces showing the peaceful weariness of those who have surrendered to a rhythm larger than themselves. They take their places in the choir stalls, open their prayer books, and begin the ancient words that have been spoken in this place for hundreds of years. And in that moment, they're simply what they always were beneath the scandals and secrets, women at prayer, seeking something beyond themselves, however imperfectly they might reach for it. The day unfolds as days have unfolded here for centuries. Work in the gardens, care for the sick, copying manuscripts, preparing meals, endless cycles of prayer marking the hours. The routines continue, patient and persistent, while the great dramas that once consumed these walls recede into memory and myth. Perhaps that is the final truth about these medieval nuns and their shocking private lives, that beneath the scandals, beyond the secrets, ordinary life continued. Women laughed and wept, worked and rested, loved and lost, prayed and doubted, exactly as humans have always done, regardless of the walls that contain them or the rules that constrain them. And now, as your own journey through these hidden histories comes to its close, you feel yourself gently released from the past's grip, returning to your own time, your own place, carrying with you these glimpses of lives long ended but somehow still alive in memory. The medieval nuns with their forbidden courtships, their secret rebellions, their desperate struggles for dignity and autonomy, they have become real to you. Not just historical curiosities, but recognizable human beings whose hopes and fears echo across the centuries. May their stories grant you understanding, their courage inspire your own navigation of difficult circumstances, and their complicated humanity remind you that people have always been beautifully, troublingly, gloriously themselves, regardless of what rules and expectations surround them. Sleep now, dear listener, and let these tales settle into your dreams like dust motes drifting through ancient sunlight. Rest well, knowing that history is not just dates and documents, but the accumulated weight of countless individual lives, each one containing entire universes of experience, and that by listening, by remembering, you have honoured those lives and kept faith with the past. Sweet dreams await you in the soft darkness, where medieval secrets and modern rest intertwine, where the boundary between then and now dissolves into the timeless space of story and sleep.